The sea took him the way the sea takes anything it doesn't recognize, without ceremony, without malice, simply because it was there and he was suddenly in it. There had been no war host arrayed against him when the tier opened, no last stand at a black gate, no army of men and elves and dwarves stretched thin across a blasted plain.
There had been only the ring, warm against his breastbone where it hung on its cord, and the world he had spent 3 ages remaking in his own image, and then, nothing that any tongue in Middle-earth or Westeros had a word for.
A wrongness in the fabric of things, as if reality itself had been a tapestry and something enormous and indifferent had simply pulled a thread. He had felt himself come apart along seams he did not know he had, and then reassemble somewhere else entirely, in salt water, in darkness, in cold. He did not drown. He had not drowned in centuries. Not truly. His hurya, his physical shape, could be broken and burned and battered, but the Fea beneath it, the old and patient will that had outlasted Numenor and the sinking of a continent, did not extinguish so easily as that. Still, the body he wore now, the fair-seeming shape he had worn since the Second Age, the one men called beautiful before they learned to fear it, took the seas beating like any mortal thing would. It was hours before the current delivered him, half drowned in coughing black water, onto a shingle beach beneath cliffs he did not recognize, under a sky whose stars did not sit where they should. He lay there a long while, simply breathing, simply feeling the wrongness of a new world settle into his bones, like cold settling into stone. The ring was still on its cord. That mattered more than any other single fact in the universe he had just been dropped into. Everything else, the strange stars, the unfamiliar salt sting of this ocean, the cliffs rising black and jagged above him, was a problem to be studied. The ring being gone would have been a catastrophe beyond study. It was not gone. His hand found it before his eyes had even properly opened, closed around it, and something in him that had been screaming since the tier opened went quiet. He allowed himself, for one unguarded moment, to simply lie on the wet stones of an unknown shore and think, so, not death then, merely elsewhere. Sauron had never in 3 ages of the world found elsewhere to be a permanent condition. Sir Andrew Estermont found him 2 days later, half a mile up the coast from where the sea had first spat him out. In the lee of a fisherman's drying shed, the man had crawled inside to escape a squall he could feel coming in his damaged, mortal-feeling limbs before it broke. Andrew had ridden out from Greenstone at the head of 6 men because a fishing skiff out of the village of Sweetport Sound had come back a day late and half swamped, its captain white-faced and swearing to Lord Eldon that something enormous had gone past them in the deep water in the black hour before dawn. Not a whale. Not a kraken out of a drunkard's tale, something that moved wrong, that the sea itself seemed to flinch from. And Eldon Estermont, old and cautious and sick to his stomach of the war already tearing the 7 kingdoms apart around his little island, had sent his nephew to see what in the 7 hells had actually happened out past the point. What Andrew found, crouched in the wet dark of a drying shed with gulls screaming overhead, was a man. Just a man. That was what struck Andrew first, and what he would tell his uncle later, and what would turn out, over the span of a war neither of them could yet imagine, to be the single most consequential misjudgment either Estermont ever made. A tall man, unarmed, wrapped in a salvaged fishing net for want of a proper cloak, gray eyes tracking Andrew's approach with a stillness that should have unsettled him more than it did. No wound that Andrew could see, for all that the man should by rights have been 3 days drowned. Just cold, and quiet, and watching. "You're a long way from any port I know, my lord," Andrew said, because the man carried himself like a lord even soaked and shivering and net-wrapped on a Stormlands beach. That was a thing Andrew would think about often in the months to come, how the bearing had been there before a single word had been spoken, how he had known to call this stranger my lord, the way a man knows to duck under a low doorway, without deciding to. "Farther than you know," the man said. His voice was low even, oddly without accent, not the clipped vowels of the Reach, not the flat hard consonants of the North, nothing Andrew could place at all, which he took at the time for evidence of some distant foreign birth, and would only much later understand was something else entirely. "My ship broke on your rocks in the storm 3 nights past. I do not know if any others of my crew survived. I would be in your debt for shelter, and for word sent to whatever lord holds this coast." It was, Andrew would reflect later, a remarkably complete lie assembled from nothing at all, no wrecked ship, no drowned crew, nothing but a torn fabric in the world, and a will old enough to have watched Numenor drown beneath the waves. And it was delivered with such unhurried, unbothered confidence that it did not occur to Andrew Estermont to doubt a single word of it. Why would it? Men did not lie about shipwrecks with the calm of men reciting the weather. And besides, the stranger's eyes, when Andrew met them, held something that made doubting feel suddenly, inexplicably, like a very great deal of effort, like wading uphill through surf.
Andrew would not have the vocabulary to describe it as will pressed directly against his own, until much later, when he had seen enough of what this man could do to the minds of stronger men than himself to understand what he had felt, that first hour, as something other than simple trust.
"Lord holds this coast is my own uncle," Andrew said. "Eldon Estermont of Greenstone. I'll take you to him myself. What should I call you, my lord?" And here was the first true decision Sauron made in Westeros, small as it seemed, and everything that followed grew from the root of it. He could have given any name. Names cost him nothing. He had worn a dozen fair seemings and false titles across 3 ages of Middle-earth, had called himself Anatar the gift-giver to elven smiths who should have known better, had let men call him whatever pleased them while he reshaped their kingdoms from inside their own councils. A name was a tool, nothing more, and he reached for one now with the same unhurried care he'd once used forging rings meant to bind. "Anon," he said, "a lord, once, of a realm across the sunset sea that no longer exists for me to return to." True enough, in its way, to hold weight when tested. His old kingdom did not exist here, whatever remained of it wherever Middle-earth now sat relative to this drowned and salt-stung shore. "I would ask your discretion in how you speak of me, until I understand better what manner of land I have washed ashore in. A drowned lord with no ship and no men is worth little to anyone, worth killing perhaps to some. I would rather be simply a guest, until I have earned the right to be more." It was, Andrew thought, a wise and humble thing for a lord to say, and it endeared the stranger to him more than any boast could have. He would not have had the frame of reference to consider that humility could be a blade honed as sharp as any other, wielded by something that had spent 3 ages learning precisely how much truth a lie needed to carry weight. Greenstone was a modest seat, as Stormland's castles went. Gray stone walls against gray winter sky, gulls wheeling over a small fishing harbor, the whole island holding perhaps 2,000 souls between the castle and its scattered villages, and old Lord Eldon Estermont received the stranger in his solar with the wary courtesy of a man whose liege lord had died of a hunting accident, that half the realm already whispered was no accident at all, and whose kingdom was fracturing into 5 claimants before the old king's body was cold in his tomb at King's Landing. "A shipwrecked lord," Eldon said, turning the words over like a man testing ice on a pond, "washing up on my shore, in the middle of the worst war the 7 kingdoms have seen since the Dance of the Dragons. Forgive me, my Lord Anon, if I find the timing curious." "You would be a poor lord if you did not," Sauron said, and something in the easy acknowledgement, the total absence of offense at being doubted, did more to disarm Eldon Estermont than any protest of innocence could have managed. "I ask nothing of you beyond shelter, until I understand what land I've fallen into, and what has become of it. I have no ship, no men, no gold beyond what the sea left me, which is to say none at all. I am, my lord, precisely as dangerous as a drowned man with empty hands, which is to say, not very." It was again technically true. He had no army here, no Barad-dûr rising black against a poisoned sky, no Nazgûl riding at his word, no vast forges of Mordor turning out blades and armor by the thousand. He had a body that could be wounded, a ring he dared not yet wear openly, in a land whose magics he did not understand, and a mind that had spent 3 ages learning exactly how far patience could carry a will strong enough to wield it. That, it would turn out, was quite far enough. "You may stay the winter, if the storms keep you from any onward journey," Eldon said finally, "because the alternative, turning away a lordless, shipless, penniless stranger who had done nothing but wash ashore and ask politely for a roof, offended every instinct of hospitality, bred into a Stormland's lord since before the Andals came. Though I'll ask you keep to the castle and not the villages, until we've had time to know you better." "Times being what they are, Sauron agreed, and inclined his head with exactly the degree of gratitude a humbled lord ought to show, and thought, behind gray eyes that gave away nothing at all, that a winter spent inside the walls of a minor coastal keep, hearing every scrap of gossip that passed through a castle at war, watching how a Stormland's household weighed loyalty against fear, learning the shape of a kingdom's fracture lines from the inside of one of its smallest joints, was very possibly the single most useful thing that could have happened to him in this strange and magic-soaked land in the whole of the first month since his arrival. He had done this before, in a sense. Not this exact shape of it. No world he had walked before wore quite this skin, this particular tangle of old gods sleeping in weirwood roots, and red priests seeing futures in flame, and something colder than either stirring. He could already half feel it on nights, when the wind came down off the northern dark, waiting beyond a wall of ice he had not yet seen, but already sensed the way a wolf senses another wolf's territory. But the shape of this, of arriving small and unknown and patient, in the household of people too proud and too worried about larger enemies to look closely at the stranger already inside their walls. This he had done in 3 ages of a different world, under different stars, and it had worked every single time until the very end. He did not intend to make the same mistakes twice. That night, in the small stone guest chamber Greenstone's household afforded him, Sauron sat by a narrow window and looked out at black water under stranger stars, and drew the ring out from beneath his collar, for the first time since the shore, and turned it once between finger and thumb without putting it on. Not yet. He could feel already, dimly, that this land answered to older and stranger powers than the ones he understood, a whisper of something vast and green and rooted in the earth itself, a colder whisper further north that made even his patience prickle with something almost like caution, and a will 3 ages old had not survived by testing an unknown world's rules with his single greatest asset before he understood what might answer.
But soon, he could hear it already, in the way Eldon Estermont's household spoke over supper of 5 kings, and no true one among them, of a fractured realm too busy tearing itself apart to notice a single quiet stranger learning its every weakness from the inside.
Westeros, he was beginning to understand, was a land built entirely from the raw materials he had spent 3 ages learning to work, pride and fear, and the hunger of small men for crowns too large for them, and old bonds of blood and oath fraying under the weight of ambition. He had not lost his old kingdom, he thought, turning the ring once more in the dark. He had simply not yet found the shape of his new one. Outside, the winter sea went on breaking against Greenstone's rocks, indifferent, the way it had broken against every shore since before there were names for oceans at all. And somewhere far to the north, past forests and rivers and the long gray wall itself, something old and cold that had been waiting in the dark far longer than Sauron had been waiting in any dungeon of his own devising, turned its attention, very faintly, toward a wrongness that had entered the world it considered its own. Neither of them yet knew the other existed. That would not remain true for long. Winter on Greenstone taught Sauron 3 things in the span of a month that would have taken a lesser mind a decade to learn, and he absorbed each with the patient, undisguised hunger of a scholar, finally given a text worth reading. The first was the shape of Westerosi belief, not the surface catechism of the Seven, recited by septons and half believed by small folk, but the deeper architecture beneath it, how thoroughly this land's people had convinced themselves that the age of true magic was dead, or dying, or at best a fading candle guttering somewhere far to the east and far to the north, safely distant from the business of kings and councils. Maester Cyrus, an aging, mild-mannered man who kept Greenstone's small library and its handful of ravens, and who had taken an interest in the shipwrecked lord's evident education, spoke of dragons and others in Greenseers, the way a man speaks of stories his grandfather swore were true, half credence and half embarrassment. It was, Sauron reflected, listening by the library's single hearth on a night when the wind screamed off the water, precisely the condition he most preferred to work in. A world convinced its old powers were spent was a world that would not look for a new one arriving quietly among them. The second thing he learned was the war itself, pieced together from raven-born fragments and the loose talk of a household with kin scattered across half the fighting fronts of the 7 kingdoms. A mad boy king dead of poison or plot in King's Landing, his heir a golden child whose parentage the small folk whispered was no Baratheons at all. A northern lord marching south with wolves at his banner and vengeance in his mouth, having named himself king in the north, to the roaring approval of bannermen who'd bled for less. 2 Baratheon brothers, the dead king's own blood, each raising a separate banner and a separate crown, as though the throne might simply be claimed twice over by force of will. And out on the narrow sea, half legend already, a girl with silver hair and 3 dragon eggs, that the smarter men in Eldon's Hall did not quite dismiss as harmless. 5 kings, Sauron thought, turning the phrase over with something close to pleasure, for a single throne meant for one. He had spent 3 ages of Middle-earth patiently forging division out of unity, corrupting Numenor from within its own court, setting the elven smiths against their own wisdom, turning Saruman's pride into a lever he could work for years before it ever showed its edge. Here, in this strange new world, the division had already been done for him. 5 kings squabbling over one throne was not a problem requiring his intervention. It was an opportunity, requiring only his patience. The third thing he learned, and this one troubled the still, deep places of his mind in a way the first 2 had not, was the cold. It came to him first as a kind of pressure at the edge of sleep. On the nights the wind turned truly bitter, a sensation he had not felt since standing in Angban's ancient dark, before even Melkor's fall, something vast and patient, and utterly without warmth, waiting somewhere far to the north behind a wall he had not yet seen but had already begun, in his private hours, to dream of. He did not speak of it to Eldon's household. He was not certain yet what words this land had for what he was sensing. The maester spoke of the others as a nursery tale, a bogeyman for wildling children beyond a wall that had stood, by all accounts, 8,000 years without breach. 8,000 years. Sauron had existed, in one form or another, considerably longer than that, and he knew with the bone-deep certainty of something that had itself once ruled from behind fortress walls, thought impregnable, that nothing which had waited 8,000 years behind a single wall of ice was a nursery tale.
He resolved, on a night in the second month of his stay, to test what he could safely test. He did not put on the ring. That temptation sat behind glass in his mind, examined often and touched never, not until he understood how this world's older magics might answer a power built for a world with entirely different rules.
But he could reach, carefully, with the parts of himself that were not the ring at all, the old will, the voice that could bend weaker minds without a word spoken, the patient study of a man who had spent 3 ages learning to read the shape of power in things that did not wish to be read. What answered him, faintly, from the north, was not mind in any sense he recognized. It was hunger with no bottom to it. It was cold with a purpose behind it, and for one instant, no longer than a held breath, he felt something on the other end of that vast, freezing distance turn its attention toward the wrongness of him, the way a spider at the edge of a web feels a single strand hum, with a weight that does not belong to any fly it has caught before. He withdrew at once, and did not reach that way again for a long while. Interesting, he thought, alone in the dark of Greenstone's guest chamber, heart, such as it was, beating faster than it had in centuries. Interesting, and worth understanding fully before it is worth touching again. Sir Andrew Estermont, meanwhile, had appointed himself something between guard and companion to the shipwrecked lord, partly at his uncle's quiet instruction, "Keep close to him, nephew, and tell me anything strange," and partly, though he would not have admitted this even to himself, because he found the stranger's company genuinely, unaccountably compelling. Anand spoke little of himself, and asked a great deal about others, and there was something in the quality of his attention, total, unhurried, as though nothing in the world mattered more in that moment than whatever small thing Andrew happened to be saying, that made a man want to keep talking, to keep earning that attention, long after he'd run out of things worth saying. "You asked me once what I thought of Lord Renly," Andrew said one gray afternoon, walking the castle walls with Annan at his side, while gulls wheeled overhead and the tide dragged out across the mudflats below. "I never gave you a proper answer." "You did not," Sauron agreed. "I assumed you were being diplomatic. Most men are, discussing their liege lord's brothers with a stranger." Andrew laughed, a short, unhappy sound. "Renly's the better man of the two," is the honest answer, and it curdles in my mouth to say it, because Stannis is the elder and the rightful claim by every law of the 7 kingdoms, and my uncle swore to Robert, not to whichever of Robert's brothers proved more likable at court. He shook his head. Renly's charming and generous, and men would follow him into the 7 hells laughing the whole way down. Stannis is none of those things, and he's right, and being right has never won a war on its own, has it? Sauron said nothing for a long moment, watching the gray water below with the particular stillness Andrew had learned meant the stranger was thinking something he did not intend to share whole. "No," Sauron said finally, "it has not. In my experience, my Lord Andrew, right and rule are rarely the same animal, and men who confuse the two tend to die confused." He turned, and there was something almost kind in the gray eyes that met Andrew's, though kindness was not, had never been, quite the right word for what moved behind them. Your Lord Eldon is sworn to Stannis by law, and to no one by love. That is a fracture, is it not? A loyalty resting on paper rather than on the heart. Those are the loyalties that break first, when the pressure comes. Aye, Andrew said slowly, not entirely sure why the observation unsettled him as much as it did. Aye, I suppose that's true enough. It is true of every house in this war, Sauron said, and looked back out at the water, and did not elaborate further, though the thought that moved beneath the words, patient, thorough, already 3 moves ahead, was this, that a realm built on fractures resting on paper rather than on the heart was a realm that a sufficiently patient hand could take apart joint by joint, and never once need to lift a sword to do it. He reflected, going to need a name that was not Anon, eventually, a title, lands, some foothold of legitimate standing from which to work, rather than the borrowed grace of a minor house's hospitality. But not yet, not until he understood this land's rules well enough to be certain the foothold he chose would hold his full weight. Patience. He had 3 ages of it to draw on, and this land, for all its strangeness, was proving itself a student of the same lessons he had spent those ages teaching. The letter arrived on a wind-swept morning 6 weeks into Sauron's stay, carried by a raven so travel-worn it nearly failed to reach Greenstone's rookery at all, and its contents changed the shape of everything. Lord Eldon read it twice, standing in his solar with Andrew and, at his own quiet insistence, framed as simple curiosity about a household that had sheltered him, Sauron present, and then set it down on the table with the particular carefulness of a man handling something that might yet explode. Renly, Eldon said, has declared himself king. Openly, not merely raised his banner in defiance of Stannis' claim, crowned himself at Highgarden with the Tyrell's full backing and the Reach's armies behind him. He marches for King's Landing within the month, so this says, with more men at his back than either Stannis or the Lannisters can readily match. He looked up, old eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He will send for his bannermen, all of us sworn to Storm's End, which is sworn in turn to Stannis by right, and to Renly by blood and old affection. We will be asked to choose. Soon. The silence that followed held the particular weight of a household realizing the war it had been watching from a safe island was about to reach in and claim it directly. What would you have me do, Uncle? Andrew asked quietly. I do not know yet, Eldon said, which was, Sauron understood watching the old man's face, the truest and most dangerous sentence a lord could speak in a moment like this one. A fracture, opening in real time, a loyalty resting on paper, about to be tested by pressure at last. Sauron said nothing.
He had learned across 3 ages precisely when silence served better than speech, and this, a proud old house teetering on the edge of a choice that would define its fate for a generation, was exactly such a moment. Let them tear at it themselves a while longer. Let the fracture widen on its own before any hand needed to touch it. But he watched.
He watched with the total patient attention of something that had spent 3 ages of a different world learning that wars were rarely won on battlefields at all. They were won in rooms exactly like this one, small and gray and windswept, where old men weighed blood against law and law against fear, and where a sufficiently patient stranger, still unknown, still merely a guest, could learn everything he needed simply by being present when the choosing began. That night, alone again by his narrow window, he drew out the ring once more, turned it in the dark, and allowed himself, for the first time since the shore, something close to satisfaction. 5 kings, he thought, and not one of them yet knows my name. Good. Let that last a while longer, too. The choice, when it came faster than Eldon Estermont wanted, and slower than the realm around him demanded, And it broke, in the end, exactly along the line Sauron had watched form in that gray solar 6 weeks prior. Renly's raven arrived a fortnight after his coronation at Highgarden, a personal summons, warm and confident in the way of a young man who had never yet been told no by anyone whose no mattered, calling his Stormlands bannermen to muster at Bitterbridge before the march on King's Landing began in earnest. Eldon read it 3 times in front of the household, and Sauron watched the old man's jaw work with the particular tension of a lifetime's careful loyalty being asked to bend somewhere it had never bent before. "Stannis will call this treason," Eldon said finally, to no one in particular, to the room, to the cold stone walls of a solar that had heard 4 generations of Estermont lords wrestle with lesser decisions than this one. And by every law of the 7 kingdoms, he is right to. The crown passes to the elder brother. Renly has no claim at all, only ambition wearing a crown it stole. "And yet," Sauron said quiet, from the corner where he had stood through the whole reading, offering the words the way a man offers a hand to someone already leaning toward a fall. "Your nephew tells me half the Stormlands lords are riding for Bitterbridge already. Men do not usually march toward treason in such numbers, my lord, unless they have stopped believing the law matters more than the man." Eldon looked at him a long moment. "And here," Sauron noted with quiet interest, the old man's eyes held something that might have been the first true flicker of suspicion Greenstone's household had shown him since the shore, a sense that the shipwrecked stranger's counsel arrived a little too precisely, a little too convenient in its timing. It did not matter. Suspicion unacted upon was simply another fracture waiting for pressure. "What would you counsel then?" Eldon said slowly. "If I asked you plainly, you who have no house, no oath, no stake in which brother sits that throne." "I would counsel nothing," Sauron said, and meant it, in the narrow sense that the word was true. He did not care, in himself, which gilded boy king or grim elder brother ultimately claimed a chair of melted swords in a city he had not yet seen. "I am a guest in your hall, my lord, and it would ill become me to weigh in on the succession of a kingdom I do not yet understand. I will say only this. You asked your nephew once what he thought of the 2 brothers, and he answered honestly, though it cost him something to say it. Perhaps the question worth asking is not which brother has the better claim on paper. It is which brother, sitting that throne, would remember which houses stood with him when the choosing was hard, and which stood against." It was again, technically nothing. No command, no lie even. Simply a redirection of a question already half answered in the room's own silence, delivered with the unhurried patience of a man arranging stones so that a wall someone else believed they were building fell in the direction he required. Eldon Estermont did not choose Renly because a shipwrecked stranger told him to. He chose Renly because Andrew's earlier honest words had already planted the seed, because half his fellow Stormlands lords were already riding for Bitterbridge, because an old man tired of a war he'd never wanted found it easier to follow the tide than stand against it, and because a quiet voice in the corner of his solar had, with perfect timing, given him a frame in which following the tide felt like wisdom rather than surrender. Greenstone's banners rode for Bitterbridge within the week. Sauron rode with them, at Andrew's quiet invitation and Eldon's reluctant permission. A guest with nowhere else to go, and a level head besides, might as well see the muster. And it was there, among 80,000 men gathered beneath 100 banners in a great sprawling camp of silk and steel, that he first laid eyes on Renly Baratheon, and understood, within the space of a single evening's feast, precisely what kind of king this land had crowned. Renly's court in the field was a marvel of a particular kind Sauron recognized at once, having built rather grander versions of it himself in ages past. Magnificence as governance, splendor deployed as a tool of rule, rather than a mere indulgence of it. Renly held feasts in a war camp that would have shamed half the true courts of the realm, dressed his household guard in gleaming green and gold plate that caught torchlight like 100 small suns, and moved through his own banquet hall with the easy, radiant confidence of a man who had simply decided, some years ago, that he was meant to be liked, and had never since encountered evidence to the contrary. "A shipwrecked lord from beyond the sunset sea," Renly said, when Andrew presented Sauron at the high table, delight plain on his handsome face. Renly collected interesting things the way other men collected debts, and a genuinely novel stranger, this deep into a war otherwise populated entirely by familiar houses and familiar grievances, was novelty enough to earn a seat near the king's own place. "Tell me, my lord Anon, is it true across the sunset sea that kings win crowns by right of blood alone, or does a man there still need to be worth following?" "Where I come from," Sauron said, meeting the young king's bright, easy gaze with a stillness that made several nearby lords quiet their own conversation without quite knowing why. A great many kings believed blood alone sufficient, and a great many of them are dead now, and forgotten, and their kingdoms belong to men who understood that a crown is worn, my king. It is not simply inherited and left to sit. Renly laughed, delighted, unguarded, the laugh of a man who had heard exactly the flattery he wanted dressed as a stranger's foreign wisdom, and clapped Sauron once on the shoulder with the easy physical warmth he extended to anyone he'd decided, in that moment, that he liked. "I knew I liked you the moment Sir Andrew told me about you. Stay close, my lord Anon. A court needs men who understand that truth, and precious few of mine seem to grasp it half so well as a shipwrecked stranger does." And so it began, not with conquest, not with corruption in any form Renly's court would have recognized as corruption, but with proximity, freely offered and freely accepted, a place at a young king's elbow earned through nothing more dramatic than saying true things in a flattering shape at precisely the moment they would be best received. Sauron had done this before, in different words, under different stars. Anatar the gift-giver had won the trust of Eregian's elven smiths the same way, offering genuine wisdom wrapped around a hook that would not show itself for years. He did not yet know what hook this particular kingdom required. He was for now simply patient, a novel and flattering presence at the edge of a young king's court, watching, listening, learning the shape of every fracture in Renly's glittering, overconfident host, while 80,000 men feasted around a war they had already, in their hearts, decided they would win. It was Sir Loras Tyrell who came closest, in those early weeks at Bitterbridge, to seeing something true beneath the shipwrecked lord's borrowed grace, not through any special insight, but through the simple, ordinary jealousy of a young man who had spent years as the brightest thing in Renly Baratheon's orbit and did not care for a new star's sudden proximity to his king. "You've charmed him quickly, for a man with no house and no gold," Loras said, cornering Sauron one evening near the horse lines, away from the feast's noise, his handsome face tight with something he would not have called fear, even under torture. "Renly likes novelty. It rarely lasts. I'd advise you not to grow too comfortable in whatever place you think you've found at his side. I have no designs on any place at your king's side, Sir Loras," Sauron said, mild, unhurried, and utterly serenely unbothered by the young knight's evident hostility, a quality that unsettled Loras considerably more than open rivalry would have. "I am a guest with nowhere else to be, watching a war I do not fully understand, in a kingdom I did not choose to wash ashore in. If my presence troubles you, I will simply keep further from the king's table. It costs me nothing either way." It was, in its way, the truth, and its very reasonableness, its total absence of the ambition Loras had gone looking to accuse, left the young knight with nothing to push against, no purchase for the suspicion he could feel, but could not yet name. He walked away from that conversation more unsettled than before it, and would spend a great many sleepless nights across the war to come trying to articulate, to Renly and later to others, exactly what it was about the shipwrecked stranger that felt wrong, and never quite managing it, because the wrongness Laura sensed was not a lie he could catch, but a stillness, a patience, a total absence of the ordinary human hungers that made ambitious men legible to each other. Sauron, for his part, noted Loras's hostility with the same detached, cataloging interest he applied to everything in this new world. A data point, nothing more. Evidence that some instruments in this land, even untrained ones, could sense a wrongness in him that the land's older magics had not yet named. Worth remembering, worth watching, in case it sharpened into something more useful, or more dangerous, later. For now, there was a war to observe, a king to stand near, and a throne 80,000 men believed they would take within the season. Sauron intended to still be standing near whoever ultimately sat it. 2 nights later, word reached Bitterbridge's camp that would matter more than either Renly or Sauron yet understood. A raven from Storm's End, terse and grim, reporting that Stannis Baratheon had broken his own siege of the family seat and turned his fleet south, not toward King's Landing, but toward Bitterbridge itself, having somehow learned, through what channel, no one in Renly's camp could yet say, the precise location and timing of his brother's muster. Renly laughed off the warning at his own high table that night, certain in the easy, unbroken confidence of a man who had never once in his charmed life faced a consequence he could not outcharm. Sauron, listening from his place near the king's elbow, said nothing at all, but he filed the raven's message away with the same patient care he gave everything else in this strange new war, and thought, watching torchlight glint off 80,000 men's worth of steel and silk and unwarranted certainty, that a king who could not imagine losing was very often the easiest kind of king to lose entirely. He did not yet know how Stannis had learned of Bitterbridge's location and timing so precisely. He suspected, with the patient, cataloging interest of a mind that had once built an entire fortress religion around exactly this kind of asymmetric knowledge, that he was about to learn this land held stranger tools of foresight than raven and rumor alone. He was not wrong. Somewhere in a tent at the edge of Stannis Baratheon's advancing fleet, a woman in red was already watching flames that showed her futures no ordinary scout could see. And somewhere far to the north, past a wall neither king nor red priestess nor shipwrecked dark lord had yet set eyes upon, something colder than any of their wars continued its own patient waiting, entirely unconcerned with which brother might claim a throne built from 1,000 melted swords. Melisandre of Ashai felt the wrongness 3 days before Stannis's fleet ever sighted Bitterbridge's watchfires, and it came to her the way all her truest visions came, not as image but as absence, a place in the flame where R'hllor's sight simply would not go. She had grown accustomed, across years of service and centuries of study before that, to the Lord of Light's fire showing her shapes within shapes, futures branching and rebranching, shadows of men who might yet be kings or corpses, depending on choices not yet made. What she felt now, staring into the brazier in her tent aboard Stannis's flagship as his fleet cut south through cold water, was different in a way that made her old, patient heart beat faster than it had in years. A knot in the weave, a place where the god's sight struck something and simply did not return, the way light strikes a stone wall, rather than passing through water. "My king," she said, When Stannis came to her that evening, grim and unsmiling as always, seeking whatever certainty the flames could offer before he committed his fleet to a fight he could not yet be sure of winning. There is a shadow at Bitterbridge that is not your brother's shadow. Stannis's jaw tightened. He trusted her sight the way a drowning man trusts a rope, without loving the rope for what it was, and he had learned over their years together to take her warnings with a seriousness he extended to almost nothing else in this world. "Explain it." "I cannot," Melisandre admitted, and the admission cost her something, a crack in the certainty she wore as armor before this hard, humorless king. "I have seen 5 kings' worth of ambition and treachery in the flames this past year, my king, and every shadow among them had a shape I could name. Lannister gold, Tyrell roses, your own brother's stolen crown. This shadow has no shape at all. It is simply there, at the edge of what the fire shows me of Bitterbridge, blotting out everything behind it, the way a hand blots out a candle. I have never felt its like before, not in Ashai, not anywhere." "A weapon," Stannis said, flat, already moving toward the practical shape of the problem the way he moved toward every problem, refusing the luxury of wonder his priestess allowed herself. Some new asset of Renly's, or the Tyrells. "Perhaps," Melisandre said, though something in her old bones told her this was not quite right. That whatever cast this shadow across R'hllor's sight was not a weapon in the ordinary sense at all. Not steel, not wildfire, not any tool a war council could plan around. It felt, if she allowed herself the comparison, less like a weapon and more like a second fire burning somewhere in the world, one that answered to no god she had ever served or studied, ancient in a way that made her own centuries feel suddenly uncomfortably brief. "I will watch it, my king. I will tell you the moment it takes a shape I can name." She did not sleep well that night, and in her dreams, such dreams as R'hllor granted his red priestesses, half vision and half nightmare, she saw a single unblinking eye, lidless and vast, wreathed in flame that gave no warmth, looking back at her across a distance her waking mind could not measure. It did not speak. It did not need to. She woke gasping, alone in her tent, certain of exactly one thing, that whatever had cast its shadow across Bitterbridge was not merely powerful, it was aware of being watched, and it had, for one terrible instant, watched her back. Sauron felt it too, the brush of something ancient and searching against the edges of his awareness, faint and distant but unmistakable. Arriving in the small hours of the same night, Melisandre woke gasping in her tent, and unlike the Red Priestess, he understood immediately and precisely what had happened, because he had spent 3 ages of a different world doing exactly what had just been done to him. Reaching with firesight into a shadow that resisted seeing, and finding, at the heart of that shadow, something that looked back. He did not sleep that night either, though sleep had never been a true necessity for him so much as a habit worn thin by mortal company. He sat instead in the small tent Renly's household had afforded him, modest by the king's own generous instruction, but a proper tent, my lord Anan, not some soldier's canvas, you've earned better than that, and turned the ring slowly between finger and thumb in the dark, and thought, with the patient, cataloging precision that had served him across 3 ages, about what he had just learned. Firesight, he thought, a discipline of prophecy bound to flame, powerful enough to reach across a war camp's distance and brush against something it could not fully perceive. This land held stranger tools than he had credited it, even after 2 months of careful study. Not merely the cold, patient thing waiting behind its wall in the north, but this too, a warmer and more immediate magic, wielded by mortal hands in service of a god whose name he did not yet know. It was, he reflected, turning the ring once more, a discipline worth understanding fully before it became a discipline worth fearing. He had not survived 3 ages by underestimating tools he did not yet comprehend.
And a magic that could see him at all, even as a shadow, even as an absence rather than a shape, was a magic that represented, for the first time since the tear had opened over that unfamiliar coastline, a genuine and immediate danger to the patient work he had only just begun.
He would need, he decided, to learn who wielded it, and for whom, and how soon. He did not yet know that the answer to all 3 questions was converging on Bitterbridge's watchfires at the head of a war fleet, under a king who trusted almost nothing in this world except steel, law, and one red priestess's increasingly urgent counsel. Stannis's fleet reached Bitterbridge 2 nights later. Under cover of a fog, Melisandre herself had coaxed thicker, with quiet words and burning offerings, and the battle that followed was not the battle either brother had planned for. Renly's host, 80,000 strong and drunk on its own certainty, had arrayed itself for a conventional field battle. Banners and cavalry, and the glittering, overconfident splendor Sauron had watched assemble itself over weeks of feasting. What Stannis brought against them instead was a night assault, disciplined and grim and utterly without mercy, his fleet's marines coming ashore in the fog-choked dark to strike the camp's edges before a proper muster could even sound, while Melisandre stood at the water's edge behind the advancing lines, watching a brazier of her own devising, searching one final time for the shadow that had haunted her dreams. She found it almost immediately, a stillness at the heart of the chaos, a single figure moving through Renly's panicking camp, not with the frantic, sword-drawn urgency of every other man around him, but with something closer to curiosity, as though the battle unfolding around him were a demonstration staged for his particular benefit, rather than a genuine crisis he might die within. "There," she breathed, and Sir Justin Massey, standing guard at her shoulder amid the fog and the screaming, and the first orange bloom of fire catching in Renly's silk pavilions, followed her pointing hand, and saw nothing at all beyond an ordinary tall man in dark, unmarked clothing, moving through the chaos with no visible weapon and no visible fear. "My lady, that's no one," Justin said. "Some camp servant, or a lord's man caught without his armor." "That," Melisandre said, and her voice had gone very quiet, very careful, the tone she used only for things she was not yet certain she believed herself, "is the shadow I have been chasing through the flames for 3 nights, Sir Justin. Whoever that man is, he is not what he appears. Watch him, do not approach him, and pray, if you know how to pray to anything at all, that he does not notice you watching." Justin Massey, a practical man in an impractical war, did not entirely believe her, but he had served beside Melisandre long enough to know that her half-believed warnings had an uncomfortable habit of proving true, and so he watched, from a safe distance, as the strange, still man moved through Bitterbridge's burning chaos, and did something Justin would spend the rest of his life failing to adequately describe to anyone who asked.
He simply stopped a fight. 2 knights, one flying Renly's antlered stag, one Stannis's flaming heart, had come together at a tense, collapsed edge, blades drawn, the kind of close, desperate, ordinary violence that was happening by the hundred across the burning camp that night.
The strange still man walked toward them without hurry, without apparent purpose, and said something too quiet for Justin to hear across the distance and the noise, and both knights, mid-swing, simply lowered their swords, looked at each other with the confused, blinking expressions of men waking from a dream they could not quite remember, and backed away from each other without another word, leaving the strange still man alone in the space where a killing had, by every law of battle, been about to happen. Melisandre, watching from the water's edge, felt the flame in her brazier gutter and dim, as though something vast had leaned close enough to breathe on it. Not a weapon, she thought, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water. A will, older than any I have ever felt, and it has just shown me, without knowing I watched, exactly how little it needs a sword to end a war. The Battle of Bitterbridge ended before dawn, and it ended in the way of most battles that end quickly and decisively, with a great deal of confusion afterward about precisely why. Renly's host, panicked and fog-blind and struck from an unexpected quarter, should by every reasonable account of war have rallied within the hour. 80,000 men do not break, simply because a few thousand Marines strike their camp's edge in darkness, not when disciplined commanders remain to steady them. And for the first hour they did rally, here and there, in ragged pockets of order amid the chaos. But something moved through those pockets in the deep hours before first light, quiet and unhurried, and wherever it passed, resistance seemed to simply soften. Knights who should have died defending a collapsed line instead found themselves backing away from fights they could not later explain retreating from.
Sergeants who should have rallied broken companies instead found their voices failing them at the crucial moment. Some instinct older than command, telling them that pressing forward here, now, into this particular stretch of burning dark, was a mistake their bodies understood before their minds could argue.
By the time the sun rose gray and reluctant over a camp half-burned and wholly disordered, Renly Baratheon's great host had not been defeated so much as it had simply lost its will to keep fighting, in a manner that several of Stannis' own commanders would later describe, in low voices, as considerably stranger than any victory they'd expected to win. Renly himself was found alive, furious, humiliated, but entirely unwounded, having been hustled from his burning pavilion by Loras Tyrell and a handful of his Rainbow Guard before Stannis' Marines could reach him personally, and the negotiations that followed, conducted in a scorched command tent between two brothers who had not spoken face to face since before the war began, were tense, brief, and utterly unlike what either brother had planned for. "You will kneel," Stannis said, flat and hard as forge iron, "or you will die here, brother, and I will grieve you exactly as long as it takes to bury you and no longer." "You won a night's confusion, Stannis, not a war," Renly shot back, golden hair soot-streaked, crown lost somewhere in the burning camp behind him, pride entirely unbroken despite the ruin around them both. "Half my host still stands. The Reach's full strength hasn't even. Half your host is dead, fled, or too frightened of whatever walked through your camp last night to lift a sword again before spring," Stannis said. "I do not know what that was, brother. I am not entirely certain I wish to know, but I know a broken army when I stand in the ashes of one, and this is a broken army, whatever won it for me." Neither brother, in that scorched tent, thought to ask the obvious question. Not who won this for me, but what, and why, and where is it now, because neither had any frame of reference for a battle won not by steel, or fire, or numbers, but by a will moving quietly through their ranks in the dark, unmaking their courage from the inside without either army ever quite understanding it had happened to them. Sauron, for his part, stood some distance from that command tent, near the horse lines, watching smoke rise from a war camp he had just, without a single drop of blood on his own hands, without a single soldier under his own banner, without so much as raising his voice above its ordinary quiet register, decisively altered the shape of. He had not intended, when the fog first rolled in, and the first screams began, to intervene at all. His plan, such as it existed yet in this strange new world, called for patience, observation, the slow accumulation of position and knowledge before any true action. But the opportunity had presented itself with such elegant simplicity, a battle already in chaos, courage already fraying at its edges, needing only the lightest touch of a will old enough to know precisely where fear already lived in a frightened man's heart to tip an army from disorder into collapse, that he had found himself unable to resist testing, in the smallest and most deniable way, exactly how far his old craft carried in this new world's flesh and blood.
The answer, it turned out, was quite far indeed. He had not needed the ring. He had not needed more than a fraction of what he once commanded as Lord of Barad-dûr. A whisper here, a suggestion there. The oldest trick a being who had once corrupted an entire Númenórean court knew. That fear, properly placed, does more work than any sword, and courage, properly unraveled, requires no visible hand to unravel it. 80,000 men had not been defeated by Stannis Baratheon's Marines alone. They had been defeated, in the truest sense, by a single quiet stranger walking through their ranks, reminding tired, frightened, overconfident men of every doubt they already carried, and had simply, until that night, managed not to listen to. It was, Sauron reflected, watching the negotiations he could not hear conclude in a scorched tent some distance away, a very small and very early demonstration of what he was capable of in this land. He had used perhaps 100th part of his true strength, and he had already, in a single night, decided the outcome of a battle that 80,000 men and 2 royal claims had gathered to settle by more conventional means. This land, he thought, watching smoke curl into a gray winter sky, does not yet understand what has arrived among it. Good. Let it not understand a while longer yet. Melisandre found him an hour later, alone by the horse lines, and the meeting that followed was the first time in Sauron's 2 months in Westeros that anything in this world looked at him and saw, with real and immediate clarity, something close to the truth. "I do not know your name," she said without preamble, stopping a respectful distance away, red robes stark against the gray morning, her own inner fire. That strange radiance Sauron had begun, over recent weeks, to sense faintly around certain figures in this land, a magic wearing flesh, the way his own long ago fair seeming had worn flesh, banked but unmistakable, even to eyes that were not truly eyes at all. "But I have seen your shadow in the flames for 3 nights, and I felt something move through this camp last night that no ordinary man commands. I would know what you are, before I decide whether you are Relor's enemy, or his unlikely instrument." Sauron studied her for a long moment, the first mortal in this land, he reflected, who had approached him not with the ordinary trust his borrowed grace inspired, but with genuine, informed wariness, backed by a magic he did not yet fully understand, and therefore could not yet safely dismiss. This was worth handling with care. "I am a stranger to your lands and your God both, my lady," he said, which held the particular quality of truth he had learned, across 3 ages, served him best when speaking to those sharp enough to catch an outright lie. True words, arranged to obscure rather than to falsify. "I do not know your Lord of Light, nor does he, I suspect, know me. What you felt last night was simply persuasion, a gift I have always carried, wherever I have traveled. I intervened because I did not wish to see good men die for a cause that was already lost the moment your king's fleet reached these shores. Is that so great a sin in the eyes of your God?" It was again a masterwork of true words arranged toward false understanding. He had not intervened out of mercy, had felt nothing resembling mercy in that scorched, panicked camp, only the cold, patient satisfaction of a craftsman testing a tool he already suspected would prove sharp. But Melisandre, for all her genuine and formidable sight, had no frame of reference yet for a being whose every word could be strictly true and entirely deceptive at once, and something in the answer's calm, reasonable shape did what such answers had always done, across 3 ages of a different world. It gave her uncertainty somewhere safe to rest.
Her lore shows me shadows, not names, she said slowly, studying him with eyes that missed very little, and understood, in this instance, considerably less than she believed. But he has shown me war coming, stranger. A true war, greater than 5 squabbling kings. A darkness gathering beyond the wall that will require every sword and every will in this broken realm to survive. If your gift for persuasion serves that fight when it comes, I will not name you enemy for whatever you did last night. If it does not, she let the sentence hang, unfinished, a warning delivered with the flat, unhurried confidence of a woman who had burned men before, for lesser threats than the one she suspected, without yet being certain, stood before her. A darkness beyond the wall, Sauron repeated, and something in his voice, some fraction of genuine interest breaking through the careful, patient mask he had worn since the shore, made Melisandre's inner fire flare, briefly, brighter than she perhaps intended it to. Tell me more of that, my lady. I find myself of late very curious indeed about what waits in your north. She told him. Not everything, not yet. A red priestess's caution running deep even in a conversation she could not fully account for wanting to continue. But enough. Enough of the others in the long night, and a wall built 8,000 years past to hold back exactly the cold and patient hunger Sauron had already felt, brush against his own awareness on nights the wind turned bitter. And Sauron listened, patient and still and utterly absorbed, and understood, for the first time since the tear had opened over an unfamiliar shore, that Westeros held not one great power worth his attention, but 2, the fractured, squabbling kingdoms he had already begun, so easily, so quietly, to unravel from within. And something older and colder and patient in a manner that felt, disquietingly, almost familiar. He would need to understand which of the 2 represented the greater opportunity. He suspected, standing in the smoke and ash of a battle he had won without a single blow struck by his own hand, that he would need to understand it soon. Word of Bitterbridge reached King's Landing 4 days later, and it reached the Red Keep in the particular garbled, half-true shape that all news of distant battles took by the time it survived enough retellings to reach a throne room. Stannis Baratheon victorious, Renly's great host broken and scattered, and beneath the plain military facts, already, the first whispered fragments of something stranger. Soldiers swearing that men in Renly's own camp had simply stopped fighting mid-battle, as though some spell had been cast over the whole of Bitterbridge in a single night. Tyrion Lannister, acting hand of the king in his sister's court, heard the rumor from 3 separate sources within the same afternoon, and found himself, against his own considerable cynicism, unable to dismiss it entirely. "Sorcery," he said to Varys, over wine in the small, cluttered chamber the eunuch called his own within the Red Keep's winding lower halls, "is what half the small folk in King's Landing are calling it by now, which tells me precisely nothing except that small folk enjoy a good sorcery story considerably more than they enjoy a boring one about poor discipline and a well-timed night assault." "And yet," Varys said, folding his soft hands together with the unhurried patience of a man who had built an empire of whispers, precisely because he took every rumor, however outlandish, seriously enough to verify before dismissing. 3 separate accounts from 3 separate sources, who did not speak to each other before reaching King's Landing, all describing the same essential shape of the thing: men laying down swords mid-fight, a stillness moving through the camp that no one could quite explain afterward. "I have learned, my Lord Hand, that when unconnected liars tell the same lie, it is worth asking whether perhaps they are not lying at all. So what precisely are you suggesting? That Stannis has found himself a sorcerer?" "I am suggesting," Varys said, "that I do not yet know, and that not knowing troubles me considerably more than knowing something unpleasant would. My little birds tell me a stranger arrived at Bitterbridge some weeks before the battle, a shipwrecked lord, sheltered first by House Estermont of Greenstone, who found his way to Renly's court and won a place at the young king's own table with remarkable speed for a man with no house, no gold, and no history anyone in the Stormlands can properly verify. My little birds tell me this same stranger was seen, during the battle itself, walking calmly through a burning camp that every other soul in it was fleeing. He spread his hands, a gesture of genuine, rare uncertainty, from a man who prided himself on very little uncertainty at all. I do not know what he is, Lord Tyrion. I know only that I would very much like to. Tyrion turned his wine cup slowly between his fingers, considering. Sorcery, in his experience, was a category small folk reached for whenever the true explanation proved too dull or too frightening to accept plainly. And yet he had learned, across a lifetime of being underestimated by people who mistook his size for his measure, that dismissing a thing simply because it sounded absurd was itself a kind of foolishness he tried, with mixed success, to avoid. Find out who he is, Tyrion said finally, quietly. If he's simply a clever man who's talked his way into Renly's confidence, that's worth knowing on its own merits. Clever men attach themselves to whichever king proves useful, and a man who's already proven useful to a losing cause might prove considerably more useful to a winning one, properly courted. And if he's something else? He did not finish the sentence and did not need to. Varys inclined his head, already composing, behind his soft and unreadable face, the shape of whatever inquiry his little birds would carry north within the week. Neither man in that cluttered chamber deep beneath the Red Keep yet understood that they had just become the first true intelligence operation in Westeros's history to turn its full attention towards Sauron, nor that the attention, however careful, however quiet, would not remain one-directional for long. Sauron felt eyes upon him within a fortnight, not the crude, easily deflected suspicion of a jealous knight like Loras Tyrell, but something more patient and considerably more skilled, a pattern of small questions asked in taverns and camps by travelers who did not quite behave like the ordinary travelers they claimed to be. A sense, faint but unmistakable to a mind that had spent 3 ages learning to detect exactly this kind of careful, distant scrutiny, of being studied by something with real reach and real patience of its own. He did not yet know the name Varys, nor the shape of the Red Keep's spider web of whispers reaching toward every corner of the realm. But he recognized the craft immediately, with something almost like respect, because it was, in its essential shape, a craft he had practiced himself across 3 ages of a different world, the patient accumulation of small truths from many small sources, building toward a picture no single informant could see whole. Someone in this land's capital, he thought, standing once more at the edge of Stannis's victorious but battered camp, watching the 2 brothers' negotiations grind on into a second week of grim, joyless truce-making, is beginning to ask the correct questions about me. It did not alarm him. Alarm was not, in the deepest sense, an emotion he still possessed in any form a mortal would recognize. 3 ages of existence had worn that particular response down to something closer to cold, immediate calculation. But it did, he acknowledged, accelerate a decision he had been turning over since Bitterbridge's smoke first cleared, that the season of quiet, patient observation from the margins of this war was drawing to its natural close, and that a being with genuine reach in King's Landing's shadows, however skilled, could only be answered by ensuring that whatever picture such a person eventually assembled of him arrived too late and too incomplete to matter. He would need, soon, a foothold considerably more substantial than a guest's welcome in a defeated king's shrinking camp. He found it, as it happened, in the collapsing peace between two Baratheon brothers, who trusted almost nothing in the world anymore, except the small, hard certainties war had left them, and in a red priestess, whose God had shown her a war beyond the wall, she could not yet fight alone. "You will kneel to me," Stannis said, "for what Sauron understood to be perhaps the fourth or fifth iteration of this same demand across 2 weeks of brittle, exhausted negotiation. Or you will take what remains of your host and go home to Storm's End, brother, and pray I have mercy enough left in me by the time this war ends to remember you as kin rather than as a rival I once let live." Renly, stripped of his crown but not of his pride, said nothing for a long moment. The golden certainty that had carried him through Bitterbridge's feasting halls had not survived its ashes intact, and something harder and more calculating had begun, Sauron noted with real interest, to take its place behind the young man's still handsome face. "I will not kneel," Renly said finally, "but I will withdraw. My claim stands, Stannis. Whatever your soldiers did to my host that night, the Reach's strength is not spent, only scattered, and I will not hand you a throne I have not yet lost, simply because you ask nicely with an army at your back." It was, Sauron reflected, watching from a discreet distance, exactly the kind of stalemate a patient hand could work with. Neither brother willing to yield, neither strong enough, in the war's current battered state, to force the other's hand outright, both of them, in their different ways, hungry for something or someone that might tip the balance decisively in their own favor. He chose Stannis. The choice was not sentimental. Sauron felt nothing resembling loyalty or affection toward either brother, nor toward their contested throne, nor toward the fractured kingdom both claimed to rule. The choice was, in the truest sense, purely tactical. Stannis held the stronger position after Bitterbridge, commanded the more disciplined remaining host, and, critically, kept at his side a red priestess, whose magic, whose firesight, whose god's warnings of a darkness beyond the wall represented precisely the kind of access to this land's deeper, older powers that Sauron had spent 2 months hungry to understand more fully. Proximity to Stannis meant proximity to Melisandre. Proximity to Melisandre meant a door, however carefully guarded, into the true shape of the war that mattered. Not the squabble of 5 kings over 1 throne, but whatever waited, patient and cold, behind a wall of ice in the deep north. He approached Stannis directly, 3 days after the failed negotiation, in the hard, spare command tent the king kept even in victory, and found the king exactly as unimpressed by charm and exactly as receptive to plain, useful truth as every account of him had suggested. "You are the one who broke my brother's camp," Stannis said, without preamble, without the ordinary courtesies a lesser king might have extended to a stranger of unproven standing. "Melisandre will not say so plainly, but I have eyes of my own, and I have heard enough soldiers' accounts to draw the obvious conclusion. I do not care for sorcery, stranger. I care for what serves the realm, and what does not. Convince me, in as few words as you can manage, which of those 2 categories you belong to." "I broke your brother's camp," Sauron said, meeting the king's flat, humorless stare without flinching, "because a divided realm cannot survive what is coming from the north, and your brother's war was prolonging that division for no better reason than his own vanity. I have no love for either crown, my king, and no stake in which brother ultimately wears it. What I have is a gift for seeing clearly what serves a cause and what merely serves a man's pride. And I believe, having watched this war for 2 months from closer than either of you knew, that you are the only claimant in this realm who has ever once, in 5 kings' worth of squabbling, spoken plainly about the true war waiting beyond your wall.
Stannis studied him a long moment, hard eyes unreadable, and Sauron understood, watching the calculation move behind that grim, humorless face, that he had said exactly the right true thing to a king who trusted almost nothing except being told hard truths plainly. "Melisandre says you are not what you appear," Stannis said finally. "She is rarely wrong about such things, whatever else she may be wrong about. What are you, stranger, beneath whatever you appear to be?" "A man," Sauron said, "who has seen more wars than you would believe, in lands farther than any ship in your fleet has charted, and who has learned, across all of them, that a house divided falls to whatever waits patiently outside its walls for the falling. I offer you counsel, my king, nothing more, unless you find it worth more than that." It was, in its way, the truest thing he had yet said in this land, wrapped once more in the shape of a lesser truth than the one he carried, and Stannis Baratheon, grim and hard and hungry, in his own iron way, for exactly the kind of unflattering counsel his brother had never once wanted to hear, extended to the shipwrecked stranger a place at his own council table that Renly's warmer, more easily won favor had never quite matched in weight. Sauron had his foothold. Somewhere far to the south, in a cluttered chamber beneath the Red Keep, a soft-handed eunuch's little birds were still gathering fragments of a picture they did not yet know had already changed shape entirely, moved from a defeated king's collapsing camp to a victorious one's hard, disciplined heart. And somewhere far to the north, past a wall that had stood 8,000 years, something old and patient continued waiting, no longer entirely alone, now, in sensing that a new wrongness had entered a world it had always considered, in its own vast and freezing way, uniquely and exclusively its own. Winter had not yet come in name. The maesters still called it autumn, technically, though the cold said otherwise. When Sauron first stood at the edge of Melisandre's fire-lit tent and asked, with the patient, unhurried curiosity of a scholar finally permitted near a text he had waited months to read, to be shown what her god's flames could teach him of the darkness beyond the wall. "R'hllor does not show his sight freely," Melisandre said, watching him across the brazier's low, steady flame, with an expression that mixed genuine wariness against something that might, in a woman less disciplined, have resembled fascination. "And I confess, stranger, I do not fully understand why I am inclined to show you anything at all. You unsettle something in me that little in this world has unsettled since I first took the red." She paused. "And yet you have not lied to me, in all our conversations, not once that I have caught." "That is rarer among the men of this realm than you might credit. I have found," Sauron said, watching the flame with an attention that was not strictly watching the flame at all so much as watching whatever moved behind it, "that truth, properly arranged, serves better than falsehood in matters that will be tested." "I do not lie to you, my lady, because I have no need to. I only ask that you show me what you have already half shown me in pieces, the shape of what waits north of your wall. I find myself of late unable to think of much else." She showed him, that night and across several nights following, fragments gathered from a lifetime's study and a god's fickle, half-glimpsed favor. The long night, 8,000 years gone and returning, the others, cold and patient, and utterly without the ordinary hungers that made mortal enemies legible. The wall itself, built by the first men and the children of the forest together in an age so old even the maesters argued over whether it had truly happened at all. And Sauron listened, and felt with each fragment she offered, the cold pressure at the edge of his awareness sharpen into something closer to recognition. "I know the shape," he thought, alone again in his own tent late that night, turning the ring slowly in dark, cold fingers. "Not this exact enemy,
This is no army of Middle-earth, no Nazgul or orc host I once commanded myself, but the shape of it, ancient, patient, building toward a single overwhelming stroke rather than 1,000 small ones. I have built such things myself in ages past. I know how they think, because I have thought this way myself when the work required it. It was, he understood with growing clarity across those cold autumn weeks, both the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity this strange new world had yet offered him. A power ancient enough to have waited 8,000 years, patient enough to plan across centuries rather than seasons, cold enough to feel nothing resembling the ordinary hungers and vanities that made Westeros's 5 squabbling kings such simple instruments to play. Such a power represented, in the truest sense, the only genuine rival Sauron had yet encountered in this land. Not Stannis, grim and hard, but ultimately, achingly mortal. Not Renly, golden and doomed. Not even the dragons across the narrow sea, whatever their raw and terrible potential. A power that had waited 8,000 years was a power that understood patience the way Sauron himself understood it, as a weapon, not a virtue. He did not yet know whether such a power could be reasoned with, corrupted, subordinated, or must simply, eventually, be destroyed. He suspected, turning the ring one final time before setting it back beneath his collar, that the answer would determine the entire shape of whatever kingdom he ultimately built in this strange new world.
He resolved, that night, that he would need to see the wall himself, and whatever waited beyond it, before that question could be properly answered. The opportunity arrived sooner than he expected, and from a direction he had not anticipated.
A raven reached Stannis' camp in the 3rd week of the brothers' brittle truce, black-sealed and travel-worn, carrying word from the Night's Watch itself, a plea, extraordinary in its desperation, for aid from any crown willing to send it, describing a wildling host massing beyond the wall, under a king beyond the wall named Mance Rayder. And beneath that immediate and conventional threat, in careful, frightened language a maester at the wall had clearly labored to phrase without sounding mad, references to the dead walking, my lords, and men who swore no oath to any of your crowns finding cold reason enough to break faith with their own graves. Stannis read the letter twice at his council table, and Sauron, present at that table now as a matter of settled routine, watched something shift behind the king's grim, humorless face. Not disbelief, but a hard, practical man's dawning recognition that a threat he had perhaps privately dismissed as his Red Priestess's overzealous faith was arriving, now, in the plain, frightened prose of men with no god to serve and no reason to lie. The realm bleeds itself dry over a throne, Stannis said slowly, while this, he tapped the letter once, hard, goes unanswered by every crown that might send aid. My brother squabbles over Highgarden's roses. The Lannister woman squats on a throne she stole through murder and lies. And the only men standing against whatever this is are 3,000 half-starved criminals and second sons in black, sworn to a wall the rest of the realm has forgotten is real. Then, perhaps, Sauron said, quiet, careful, offering the thought the way he had learned, across months in this land, served best, not as command, but as the obvious conclusion a wise king might reach on his own. The throne is not in fact the war worth winning first, my king. Stannis looked at him a long moment, and something in the look held more genuine consideration than Sauron had yet earned from this hard, suspicious man across weeks of careful, patient counsel. You would have me abandon my claim, Stannis said, to march north instead, and defend a wall that is not mine to defend, against an enemy half my own council still believes is a wet nurse's tale. I would have you understand, Sauron said, that a crown won over a kingdom that no longer exists, because whatever comes south from beyond that wall has ended it first, is a crown worth considerably less than the effort required to win it. I do not say abandon your claim, my king. I say the letter in your hand describes the only war in this entire realm that will matter at all if its worst fears prove true. Every other war, mine included, in the sense that I have none, is a war for the right to rule Ash. It was, Sauron reflected even as he said it, a genuinely strange sensation, counseling a mortal king toward a war against a power he himself did not yet understand, had not yet decided whether to fight, corrupt, or simply observe from a careful distance. But the council served his purposes regardless of its outcome. If Stannis marched north, and the others proved the genuine world-ending threat Melisandre's vision suggested, Sauron would be present at the one battle in this land that actually mattered, positioned to observe, to learn, to choose his own eventual course, with far better information than any distant, cautious study could provide. And if the threat proved smaller than feared, he would have lost nothing but a season's patience, still positioned at a hard, capable king's right hand, still building, quietly and thoroughly, the foothold he required. There was no version of this choice, he understood, with the same cold clarity that had guided 3 ages of careful strategy in which marching north cost him anything at all. Stannis Baratheon, staring at a letter that described dead men walking and a wall 8,000 years old, suddenly, urgently, insufficient, made the hardest decision of a war already full of hard decisions. "We march for the wall," he said, "within the fortnight. Let my brother keep his roses and his stolen crown a while longer. There will be no throne worth sitting, for any of us, if that letter speaks true and no one answers it." Melisandre, informed of the king's decision that same evening, sought Sauron out once more at the edge of her firelit tent, and this time there was something in her expression that had not been there in their earlier conversations, not merely wariness, but a dawning, uneasy recognition that the stranger's careful counsel had, in a matter of days, redirected an entire war's strategic focus, with an ease that unsettled her considerably more than his earlier battlefield sorcery had. "You wanted this," she said, not quite an accusation, not quite a question. "The march north. I do not yet understand why, but I have watched you these past weeks, stranger, and I have learned to trust that nothing you do is without purpose, however patiently concealed. I want to see what waits beyond your wall," Sauron said, and this at least held nothing but truth. "I have felt its shadow for months now, my lady, the same as you have felt mine in your flames. I would very much like to finally see the thing itself, rather than merely its shadow, and I suspect, from everything you have shown me of your God's visions, that I am not the only power in this world who has begun, very carefully, to take notice of the other." Melisandre studied him a long moment in the firelight, red robes stirring faintly in a cold wind blowing down, already, from the direction they would all march within the fortnight. "R'hllor's flames have never shown me 2 shadows at once before you came," she said quietly. "Yours and the one beyond the wall. I begin to wonder, stranger, whether the Lord of Light brought you to this world not merely to serve the war against the dark." She paused, and something moved behind her ancient knowing eyes that was very close, in that unguarded moment, to genuine fear. But because he knew that only a shadow as old and strange as yours could ever hope to stand against it. Sauron said nothing to that. There was, in the deepest and most private chambers of a mind that had ruled fortresses and forged rings and outlasted the drowning of an entire proud civilization, no answer he was yet prepared to give, even to himself, about which of those two roles he ultimately intended to play in the war now gathering, at last, toward the true and ancient enemy this strange world had been hiding from him since the moment he first washed ashore.
He only turned and looked north, toward a wall he had not yet seen, and a cold he had felt for months without a name, and thought, with the patient, hungry curiosity of a being who had spent 3 ages learning exactly how much could be gained from understanding an enemy before ever choosing to fight it, soon. The march north took the better part of a month, and Sauron used every day of it the way he had used every day since the shore, watching, learning, cataloging the shape of a mortal army's endurance against a cold that deepened with every mile past the neck, until even Stannis's hardest veterans, men who had weathered sieges and starvation and the grinding attrition of a war that never quite ended, began to speak in low voices of a chill that felt, somehow, deliberate. He felt it too, more clearly with every league north, the pressure at the edge of his awareness sharpening from a distant whisper into something closer to a held breath, vast and patient, and he was now nearly certain, aware in some fashion of an army marching toward it that carried, within its ranks, a wrongness the ancient cold did not yet have a name for either. Castle Black, when they finally reached it, struck Sauron as a monument to a war fought and half forgotten by everyone, except the men actually dying in it. A sprawling, half-ruined complex of 19 once-manned castles, reduced now to 3 still-standing watch along 100 leagues of wall. Garrisoned by a night's watch reduced to a few hundred men where thousands had once served, black-cloaked and grim and entirely unprepared, by any honest accounting, for a war their own order's ancient purpose had been founded to fight, and had, across 8,000 years of peace, gradually forgotten how to. He met Jon Snow within his first day at the castle, a young, serious black brother recently returned, by all accounts, from a dangerous ranging beyond the wall that had ended in the death of his Lord Commander, and a great deal of half-suppressed controversy about a wildling woman he had brought back with him, and a king beyond the wall's host he claimed, with evident sincerity, was marching south, not to conquer, but to flee something far worse than any southern army. "You believe him," Sauron observed, standing beside Stannis at the base of the wall's great winch cage on their second day at Castle Black, watching the young black brother argue his case before the watch's officers with the flat, unpolished conviction of a man who had seen something and could not make anyone who hadn't seen it understand its full weight. "The wildling king. You believe his host is fleeing the true enemy, rather than exploiting a watch too weak to stop them. I believe 100,000 wildlings do not abandon everything they own, and march toward a wall that has killed their kind for generations," Stannis said, "unless something considerably worse than that wall is behind them. I have learned to trust plain, ugly reasoning over comforting assumptions, stranger. It has served me better across this war than any other counsel I have received." He glanced sidelong, something almost wry in his hard, humorless expression. Present company sometimes accepted. Sauron said nothing to that, watching Jon Snow instead, young, serious, carrying himself with a gravity that seemed, in Sauron's long and patient study of mortal men, to sit oddly heavy on shoulders that could not yet have seen more than 20 years of life. There was something in the young man's bearing that snagged at Sauron's attention in a way few mortals in this land had yet managed. Not power, not yet, nothing he could name with any precision. Simply a sense, faint but unmistakable, of a man standing closer to the fault line between two worlds than he yet understood himself to be standing. Worth watching, Sauron thought, filing the observation away with the same patient care he gave everything else in this strange land. Worth watching closely. It was Melisandre, 3 nights after their arrival at Castle Black,
who finally arranged what Sauron had been patiently, carefully working toward since the march north first began, a journey beyond the wall itself, framed to Stannis' council as a scouting mission ahead of any larger commitment of forces, small enough not to invite the full weight of the Watch's caution, significant enough to finally let Sauron see, with his own eyes, the thing whose shadow he had felt for months.
"You need not come," Stannis said, when the small party, himself, Melisandre, a handful of the Watch's most experienced rangers, and Sauron, assembled at the wall's northern gate in the gray, bitter dawn. "This is not counsel-giving, stranger. This is the war itself, and I have seen enough of what you can do in a battle to value you closer to my side than farther from it. But I'll not command a man with no oath to me into a danger he has no obligation to face. I have no oath to anyone in this land, my king," Sauron said, "which is precisely why I go. I have felt this enemy's shadow since before I ever set foot in your camp. I would very much like at last to see it plainly, rather than merely feel its edge in the dark." He paused, and something in his voice, quiet as it was, carried a weight that made even Stannis' hard, unreadable face flicker with something like reassessment. "I do not think, my king, that this is a war any of us can afford to face half-blind. I would rather be the one among us who sees clearly, whatever the cost of seeing." They rode beyond the wall into a silence that Sauron, across 3 ages and countless dark and terrible places, had rarely felt the equal of, not the ordinary quiet of an empty wilderness, but a stillness that felt, in some fundamental way, attentive, as though the haunted forest itself held its breath around them, waiting to see what the strangers moving through it would do. They found the first sign of what they'd come seeking on the second day, a wildling village, abandoned in obvious haste, cook fires still faintly warm, and scattered through the empty huts and the churned, frozen mud beyond them, the unmistakable evidence of a slaughter that had left remarkably little blood for the number of bodies clearly, by every scattered belonging and half-eaten meal, meant to have been present. "They took them," one of the rangers said, low and hoarse, crouched beside a small, empty cradle overturned in the frozen mud. "All of them. Every man, woman, and child in this village, and left near enough no bodies at all behind to show for it." Sauron crouched beside the ranger, studying the scene with the same cold, cataloging attention he had given every strange and terrible thing this land had shown him so far, and felt, for the first time since the tear had opened over an unfamiliar shore, something that was not quite fear, because fear was an emotion 3 ages had worn nearly smooth in him, but was close enough to fear's ancient, half-forgotten shape to give him pause. "They do not kill," he thought, studying the absence of blood, the absence of struggle, the too neat abandonment of a village that should, by every ordinary law of violence, have shown far more evidence of the deaths that had clearly occurred within it. They convert. They take, and what they take becomes theirs, and joins whatever army they are building beyond whatever horizon we have not yet reached. It was, he understood with growing and genuine unease, a strategy he recognized, not because he had ever employed precisely this method himself, but because the underlying logic was one he had built entire ages of his own dominion upon. That the most efficient conquest was not the conquest that destroyed its enemy's strength, but the conquest that absorbed it, turned every fallen foe into one more soldier for the following battle. He had done this with men, in ages past, bent to rings and promises and the slow corruption of fear and ambition. Something in this cold, patient enemy was doing the same thing to the dead themselves, and the sheer scale of the strategy, every corpse a potential soldier, every battle a net gain regardless of who won it, represented, he understood with a clarity that chilled him in a way little in 3 ages had managed, possibly the single most efficient engine of conquest
he had ever personally witnessed. "We should turn back," Melisandre said quietly, standing at the edge of the ruined village, her inner fire, that faint, warm radiance Sauron had grown accustomed to sensing around her, banked low and uneasy in a cold that seemed, here, beyond the wall, to press against even a red priestess's borrowed flame. "R'hllor's sight grows dim this close to whatever did this. I do not think we are meant to see more than we already have. We came to see," Sauron said, straightening from his crouch beside the empty cradle, and something in his voice had gone very quiet, very still, in a way that made even Stannis glance at him with fresh and careful attention. "I would see a little further yet, my lady, before we turn back." They found it an hour later, at the edge of a frozen lake beneath a sky gone the color of old bruises. Not an army, not yet. Nothing so organized or so visible. Simply a single figure, tall and pale and terribly still, standing at the tree line across the ice, its eyes the exact, unmoving blue of the sky just before true dark falls, watching the small party of intruders with an attention that felt, to every mortal in that clearing, like the coldest thing any of them had ever felt directed at them. It was watching Sauron most of all. He felt it, with a certainty that settled into old and patient bones, like the answer to a question he had been asking for 3 long months. The ancient, cold power he had sensed since his first night on Greenstone's shore had, at last, turned its full and undivided attention toward the singular wrongness of him, and was, in its own vast and freezing way, considering, carefully, patiently, the way he himself might consider a new and unclassified variable suddenly introduced into a calculation 8,000 years in the making, exactly what he was, and exactly what to do about it. Neither Sauron nor the pale, watching figure across the frozen lake moved, for a long-held moment, while wind that carried no warmth at all stirred the black branches around them. Then, without a word, without any gesture a mortal eye could have named as communication, the pale figure turned, and walked unhurried into the tree line, and was gone. "What?" Stannis said, very low, breaking a silence that had held the entire clearing frozen in place. In every one of the 7 hells was that. Sauron did not answer immediately. He was still watching the tree line, where the pale figure had vanished, turning over, with the same patient, cataloging precision he applied to everything in this strange new world, the single, unmistakable impression that had passed between himself and that ancient, watching enemy in their brief, wordless meeting. "It knows me," he thought, "not my name, not my history, but it knows, the way I know, what kind of thing I am, and it did not attack, it did not flee, in any sense that frightened wildlings or panicked black brothers might recognize. It simply looked and considered and withdrew, the way one old and patient power considers another, before deciding whether the meeting calls for war or for something else entirely. That, Sauron said finally, turning back to Stannis and Melisandre and the small, shaken party of rangers, was the first honest look either of us has yet gotten at the other, my king. I do not think it will be the last. He did not say the rest of what he was thinking, that somewhere in the ancient, patient calculation now turning behind that pale, unmoving enemy's inhuman eyes, a question had just been opened that Sauron himself was not yet certain he knew the answer to. Whether the great other's oldest enemy, upon finding a new and comparably ancient power newly arrived in its world, would move to destroy it, or to treat with it, or, and this thought, cold and patient and entirely his own, lingered longest in the silence of the ride back toward the wall, whether it might, in time, be made to serve. They rode back through the haunted forest in a silence that no one in the party seemed inclined to break, and it was not until the wall itself rose pale and impossible against the gray sky ahead of them that Stannis Baratheon finally spoke the question that had been sitting, unaddressed, in every mind since the frozen lake. "You said it looked at you," Stannis said, low, riding close beside Sauron at the column's head. "Not at me, not at Melisandre, for all her god's fire. You." "Yes," Sauron said, offering no more than the single word, because there was, in truth, no version of the fuller answer he was prepared to give a mortal king. Not yet, not until he understood considerably more of what had passed in that wordless, frozen meeting than he currently did. "Why? I do not fully know, my king," Sauron said, which was, remarkably, close to true. "I know only that whatever waits beyond your wall recognized something in me that it did not recognize in you, or in your priestess, or in any other soul in this land it has troubled itself to notice across 8,000 years of patient waiting. I intend to understand what that recognition means before I offer you any counsel built upon guessing at it." Stannis studied him a long moment, hard eyes narrowed against the cold wind coming down off the wall, and said nothing further. But Sauron understood, watching the king's grim, calculating face, that a new and careful distance had opened between them in the space of that single frozen lake, a distance built not from distrust exactly, but from the plain, unavoidable recognition that whatever service the stranger had rendered so far, whatever counsel had won a broken war's brief and fragile focus, the stranger himself remained, in the deepest sense, an unknown quantity, one that ancient and terrible enemies apparently recognized on sight, in ways no living man in the Seven Kingdoms yet could. It was Jon Snow, 3 days after their return to Castle Black, who finally asked Sauron the question none of the high-born lords and grim kings around him had yet found the plain, unguarded nerve to ask directly. "You're not from anywhere I've heard of," Jon said, finding Sauron alone at the top of the wall in the gray hour before dawn, the two of them standing at the great ice barrier's edge, looking north across a haunted forest that neither, now, could look upon with quite the same innocence as before. "Not the free cities, not anywhere across the narrow sea the maesters have charts for. I've heard every story the Black Brothers tell in the common hall, my lord, and I've never once heard of a land called what you call yours." "Because it is not a land any map in this world has charted, Lord Snow," Sauron said, and something in the plain, unhurried honesty of the admission, offered freely, for once, without the careful architecture of true-shaped falsehood he extended to nearly everyone else in this realm, surprised even himself, a little, in the saying of it. There was something in this young man's bearing, still, that made careful deception feel, oddly, like wasted effort. I do not think I could explain to you where I truly came from in any terms your maesters would credit as sane. I am, in the truest sense I can offer you, considerably further from home than any shipwrecked lord from beyond the sunset sea." Jon was quiet a moment, watching him with the same serious, unflinching attention he seemed to bring to everything. The wildling's desperate flight, his dead Lord Commander's final orders, a war beyond the wall that half his own brothers still refused to credit as real. "The thing you saw at the lake," Jon said finally, "it looked at you the way it's never looked at any of us. I was beyond the wall myself, not so long past. I've seen what they do to villages, to men, to the dead who don't stay dead once they've touched it. I never once felt it consider me, the way your king says it considered you." "No," Sauron agreed. "I do not think it has ever, in 8,000 years, found reason to consider a mortal man the way it considered me at that lake." "What does that make you, then?"
John asked, not accusing, not frightened in any obvious way, simply asking, with the same plain, direct honesty that seemed to be the whole of his character, the question every other soul in this land had circled without quite landing on. If you're not simply a man.
Sauron looked out over the haunted forest a long moment, the pale light of a reluctant dawn beginning to touch the tops of the black trees, and gave, for reasons he would turn over privately, for some while afterward, without ever quite resolving them to his own satisfaction, an answer closer to true than any he had yet offered another living soul in this world. "I am something very old, Lord Snow," he said. "Old enough to remember ages this world has no record of at all. I built a kingdom once, in a land far from here, out of exactly the kind of patient, careful work I have been doing in yours these past months, binding men to purposes larger than themselves, turning fear and ambition into instruments of a single will. I do not tell you this to frighten you. I tell you because you asked plainly, and because I find, oddly, that I would rather you know something true about me than believe something comfortable and false, the way the rest of this realm seems content to." "And the thing at the lake," John said, "it knew that about you, on sight." "It knew," Sauron said, "that I am, in the oldest sense, either of us likely has a word for, its kin, not its ally, not its friend, but its kind, an old power, patient and terrible, walked into a young world in the shape of a man. I do not yet know what that recognition will mean for either of us, going forward. I suspect, Lord Snow, that I will need to decide, and likely soon." John said nothing for a long time, looking out over the same haunted forest, the same reluctant dawn, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Sauron, for the first time in 3 long ages of studying and using and discarding countless mortal men, genuinely reconsider his estimation of the young man standing beside him. "Then decide right," John said simply. "Whatever you are, whatever you've done in whatever land you came from, I've seen what's coming south, my lord, closer than any king in this realm. It doesn't care about crowns or claims or which brother sits which throne. It only wants everything in the end. Everyone, if you're half as old and half as powerful as that thing at the lake seemed to think you are, then you might be the only soul in this entire war who actually gets to choose which side of it you stand on, instead of simply being swept up in whichever way the wind blows." He met Sauron's eyes, steady, unflinching, young in years and old already in the particular weight of things he'd seen no man his age should have seen. "Most of us don't get that choice. Choose right." He left Sauron alone at the top of the wall after that, and Sauron stood a long while in the cold, gray morning, watching a haunted forest that held, somewhere within it, an enemy ancient enough to be his equal, and turned over, with more genuine uncertainty than he had permitted himself since the tear first opened over an unfamiliar shore, the plain, unadorned weight of a young man's simple request. Choose right. He had not, in 3 ages of existence, been asked to choose right by anyone at all. He had been asked, across countless councils and countless conquered kingdoms, to choose wisely, to choose strategically, to choose in service of dominion and order and a will that brooked no rival. No one, not the elves who had once trusted him, not the Númenóreans who had once worshipped him, not the Nazgûl who had served him without question across 3 ages, had ever thought to ask him to choose right, as though the word carried some meaning independent of power, independent of what could be won or lost or dominated. He found, standing atop a wall of ice in a world not his own, that the question troubled him rather more than he expected it to. The council that convened in Castle Black's ruined common hall 3 nights later was not, by any measure, a comfortable one. Stannis presided, grim and hard as ever, flanked by Melisandre's watchful red-robed presence and a scattering of the Watch's senior officers, men who had spent decades believing themselves the last, forgotten guardians of a threat everyone else had dismissed as children's stories, and who now found themselves, abruptly, at the center of a war that a southern king and his mysterious foreign counselor had suddenly decided mattered more than any throne. "We cannot hold this wall with 300 men," Sir Dennis Mallister said flatly, an old weathered ranger whose decades of service had worn any illusion of easy hope down to plain, grinding practicality. "Whatever that thing at the frozen lake was, whatever army it commands, we know it took an entire wildling village without leaving so much as a proper corpse behind to bury. 300 black brothers, and whatever host you've marched north with us, my king, is not going to be enough." "Then we find more," Stannis said. "Every house in the north owes fealty to House Stark, and House Stark owes the realm a debt for what happened at the Red Wedding that Robb Stark's bannermen will want paid in blood, one way or another. I will offer legitimization to every northern bastard and disinherited son willing to bend the knee and bring me swords for this wall. I will offer pardon to every wildling who kneels rather than dies fighting beside the dead." It was, Sauron noted with quiet interest, a genuinely shrewd offer, the kind of pragmatic, unsentimental calculation he had come, across these months of careful observation, to respect in this hard and humorless king, even as he recognized its limits plainly enough. Political maneuvering, however clever, moved at the speed of ravens and armies, and mortal men's slow, grudging trust. The enemy beyond the wall moved at the speed of an 8,000-year plan finally nearing its execution. "There is another matter, my king," Sauron said, when the council's initial arguments over strategy and manpower had run their first exhausted course, "that I believe requires this council's attention before any plan for holding this wall can be properly weighed." Every eye in the ruined hall turned toward him, Stannis's flat and calculating, Melisandre's watchful and uneasy, Jon Snow's steady and, Sauron noted, carrying something almost like anticipation, as though the young man already half-guessed what was coming. "I possess," Sauron said, "certain resources. Certain knowledge, drawn from lands and ages this council has no frame of reference for, that I have thus far kept largely to myself, out of simple caution in a world I did not yet understand. I have seen, at that frozen lake, an enemy I recognize in ways none of you can. I believe I can offer this war considerably more than counsel, and a gift for persuasion on a battlefield, if this council is prepared to trust a stranger with resources no army in this realm has ever seen deployed." "Speak plainly," Stannis said. "This council has little patience left for careful phrasing, stranger, whatever else it has patience for." Sauron considered his next words with more care than he had given almost any decision since the tear first opened over Greenstone's shore, because this, he understood with total clarity, was the true turning point, the moment at which the patient, quiet accumulation of position and knowledge that had carried him safely through 5 months in this world would finally, unavoidably, tip into open and undeniable revelation. He drew the ring out from beneath his collar and held it up in the firelight and did not, yet, put it on. "This," he said, "was forged by my own hand, in a land and an age this council cannot imagine, as an instrument of dominion over the wills of lesser men. I have not worn it since arriving in your world, because I did not yet understand how your world's own magics, your wall, your fire god, whatever ancient sorcery holds the dead in their long night beyond it, might answer a tool built for entirely different rules. I believe, having now stood face to face with your enemy and felt it recognize me for what I truly am, that the time for that caution has passed." He looked around the ruined hall, meeting each shocked, wary, disbelieving face in turn, and let the full and terrible weight of 3 ages of patient power finally, deliberately, show itself in his voice for the first time since the shore. I did not wash ashore in your world an ordinary man, my lords. I was, in the land I came from, a power your long night's darkest legends would recognize as kin, and I believe, standing now at the edge of a war that may decide whether this entire realm survives the coming winter, that pretending otherwise any longer serves none of us. The silence that followed held the particular, absolute quality of an entire room recalculating, in real time, everything it believed it understood about the stranger who had sat quietly at its councils for months. Jon Snow, alone among them, did not look surprised. He looked, instead, like a man who had already, in his own quiet way, decided which side of this war he intended to stand on, regardless of what the stranger beside him ultimately chose, and who was waiting, with the same patient, unflinching resolve that had carried him through every trial this cold and terrible war had already put him through, to see whether the ancient power now standing revealed before them would choose the same. Stannis Baratheon was not, by nature or training, a man who startled easily. A lifetime of grim duty and thankless service had worn any capacity for simple astonishment down to something harder and more immediately practical. But even he sat in silence for a long moment after Sauron's revelation, his hard eyes moving between the golden ring held aloft in torchlight and the still, patient face of the man holding it, visibly working through the plain, unavoidable arithmetic of what he had just been told. A power, Stannis said finally, your own long night's legends would recognize as kin. He said it flatly, testing the words the way he tested every claim, for weight and consequence rather than wonder. You are telling this council, plainly, that you are no ordinary man from any distant shore, but something closer in kind to the enemy currently marching toward my wall. I am telling this council, Sauron said, that I am ancient and powerful, and that I have spent 3 ages of a world not your own building, and breaking kingdoms with tools this realm has never seen deployed. I am telling you that the thing which looked at me across that frozen lake recognized something in me it has never recognized in any mortal man of this world, in 8,000 years of patient waiting. I am not telling you that I serve it, my king. I am telling you that I understand it, its patience, its methods, the shape of a war fought across centuries rather than seasons, in ways no living soul in the 7 kingdoms currently can. And this, Sir Dennis Mallister said, old and weathered, and entirely unwilling to let the moment's gravity smooth over the plain, dangerous question sitting at its center. This ring you hold. What does it do? Sauron turned it once between his fingers, watching torchlight catch along its unmarked golden band, and understood, with the same patient calculation that had guided every choice since the shore, that the answer he gave now would shape everything that followed. How much trust this hard, suspicious counsel extended him, how much genuine partnership he might yet build with a king whose grim pragmatism he had come, across these months, to find genuinely useful, and how much fear, ultimately, would poison whatever alliance he hoped to build against the enemy waiting north. It binds, he said, wills, minds, the loyalty of those who wear rings I forged to answer to it. I do not offer to use it upon this council, or upon any soul in this realm who has not freely chosen to serve alongside me. I tell you it exists because I believe, standing at the edge of a war none of us fully understands yet, that this council deserves to know the full shape of what stands among you, not merely a gift for persuasion and a stranger's uncanny battlefield instincts, but power enough, potentially, to turn the tide of a war 8,000 years in the making, if wielded with the same careful precision I have used it with, in ages past, to build entire kingdoms from nothing.
It was, Sauron understood even as he said it, a genuinely delicate balance to strike. Enough truth to earn trust, enough restraint to avoid the outright terror that a fuller accounting of the ring's true history and purpose would surely provoke in men who had only just finished absorbing the existence of an army of the dead. He did not tell them of Numenor's drowning, of Aragion's ruin, of 3 ages spent forging exactly the kind of division and corruption that had, until recently, been quietly at work on their own fractured kingdom. He told them enough to be useful, and no more. Melisandre, who had said little through the whole of the revelation, finally spoke, her voice carrying the particular, careful weight of a woman recalculating a faith she had built across years of service, around visions that had never quite prepared her for a shadow this vast and this deliberately concealed. R'hllor showed me your shadow for months before you ever revealed yourself plainly, she said. I told myself you might be his unlikely instrument, a strange gift, arrived from beyond any land his fire has ever shown me, sent to aid the true war against the dark. She studied him a long moment, red-robed and ancient, and for the first time since Sauron had known her, genuinely uncertain. I do not know now whether that was ever true, or whether I simply wanted it to be true, because the alternative, that something this old and this powerful walked into my war for reasons entirely its own, frightened me considerably more than I was prepared to admit. Both may be true, my lady, Sauron said, and meant it, in the narrow and careful sense that he had, across these months, come to genuinely value the particular usefulness of this alliance. This war, this world's strange and patient fire god's apparent interest in the outcome, even as he had not, in the deepest chambers of a will 3 ages old, surrendered a single fraction of his own ultimate purposes to serve anyone else's cause but his own. I did not come to this world seeking your war, but I have found it, and I find, the longer I study it, that I am not entirely indifferent to how it ends. It was, in its way, the truest thing he had said in the whole of that long and difficult council, and it was true precisely because Sauron himself did not yet fully know what he wanted the ending to be, an uncertainty that unsettled him privately far more than he permitted any soul in that ruined hall to see. Stannis, in the end, made the pragmatic choice that Sauron had, across months of careful counsel, come to expect from him. I do not trust you, the king said, flat and plain, once the council's initial shock had settled into something closer to grim, working calculation. I do not think I ever will, fully, whatever aid you offer this war. But I have watched you win a battle without lifting a sword, and I have heard your counsel prove sound more often than not, across months I did not always credit at the time, and I have seen, with my own eyes, that thing beyond the wall look at you the way it has never looked at any of the rest of us. I would be a fool to refuse whatever power you offer this fight, stranger, whatever my private reservations about the nature of that power. Then I offer this, Sauron said. I will not command your men, my king. I will not claim any crown, any title, any authority in this realm, beyond what you or this council chooses to extend me. I ask only this, that when the true battle comes, and it is coming, I promise you that with more certainty than any maester's chart or red priestess's vision, you trust my counsel on how to meet it, even where that counsel runs counter to every ordinary instinct this realm's wars have taught you. Stannis studied him a long moment, hard eyes weighing something that had no easy scale to measure it by, and finally, grudgingly, extended a single scarred hand. Done, the king said, for now. Betray this trust, stranger, and I promise you, whatever power that ring holds,
I will find a way to make you regret ever washing ashore on Estermont's rocks." Sauron clasped the offered hand, and felt, in the simple, mortal warmth of it, something he had not expected to feel in this strange and difficult moment. Not triumph exactly, though there was satisfaction in it, the quiet pleasure of a foothold secured through patient work rather than force. Something closer, if he allowed himself the honesty of naming it privately, to genuine respect for a king who had just extended trust to an admitted and ancient power on nothing more than months of careful observation and a battlefield instinct he could not fully explain. A useful king, he thought, releasing the handshake, watching Stannis turn back to his officers and the grinding practical business of preparing a broken wall for a war none of them yet fully understood. Perhaps in time, something more than merely useful. It was a thought that would have troubled him greatly in earlier ages, on worlds where such sentiment had only ever preceded betrayal or ruin. He did not yet know what to make of finding it, unbidden and quietly persistent, taking root in a mind that had spent 3 ages believing itself entirely beyond the reach of anything resembling genuine regard for a mortal creature's fate. Word of the stranger's true nature reached King's Landing within the month, carried by Varys's patient network of little birds, now finally, belatedly assembling a picture considerably stranger and considerably more alarming than Tyrion Lannister had braced himself to receive. "An ancient power," Tyrion repeated, reading the coded report a third time in the privacy of his own chambers, wine forgotten at his elbow. Not a sorcerer, not some clever pretender playing at magic to win a king's favor. "An ancient power, Varys, that your birds swear openly revealed itself before Stannis' own war council, holding some manner of ring the reports claim can bind men's very wills. So my little birds tell me," Varys said, his usual unflappable calm carrying, for once, a genuine thread of unease. "And my little birds, my Lord Hand, have rarely proven so consistently alarmed by a single report in all the years I have kept them in my service. Something has entered this war that none of us anticipated, and it has, apparently, decided that Stannis Baratheon's cause is the cause worth attaching itself to." Tyrion set the report down and looked out over King's Landing's smoke-hazed skyline and felt, for the first time since taking up the burden of acting hand in his sister's dysfunctional and increasingly desperate court, a genuine and specific dread that had nothing to do with sieges or wildfire or his sister's endless capacity for self-destructive scheming. "We need to know more," he said finally. "Considerably more, and considerably faster than we have managed so far. If Stannis Baratheon has genuinely allied himself with something this old and this powerful, that changes every calculation this war has been built upon. And if what your birds describe of the enemy beyond the wall proves half as real as this report suggests, it may change considerably more than merely this war." He looked back at Varys, small and tired and, for once, entirely without the practiced wit he usually wore as armor against exactly this kind of moment. "Send word to Dragonstone, and to Winterfell, and to every house in this realm, still capable of listening to reason over ambition. Whatever else divides us, my friend, I begin to suspect we are all, every crown and every claim among us, running considerably out of time to keep pretending this war is only about a throne." Varys inclined his head, already composing, behind his soft and unreadable face, the shape of ravens that would soon carry a warning few, in this fractured realm, were yet prepared to properly hear, while far to the north, at the edge of a wall, 8,000 years old, an ancient power newly and openly revealed turned his patient attention toward the deepening work of a war he had not yet decided, in the truest and most private chambers of his own vast and calculating will, whether he ultimately intended to win for this world's sake, or simply to survive long enough to claim for his own. The Iron Bank of Braavos did not, as a rule, concern itself with the internal politics of distant kingdoms, unless those politics threatened the reliable repayment of outstanding debts, and it was precisely this narrow, unsentimental calculus that brought a modest but significant delegation to Dragonstone in the depths of that hard early winter. 3 representatives, sober-robed and coolly courteous, led by a sharp-eyed factor named Tycho Nestoris, who had crossed the narrow sea not to offer aid, but to determine, with the patient thoroughness of an institution that had outlasted 100 kings and would outlast 100 more, exactly which of the 7 kingdoms' many claimants still represented a debt worth collecting.
"The Crown owes the Iron Bank a considerable sum," Tycho said to Stannis, and the cold, unadorned solar Dragonstone afforded such visitors, his voice carrying the particular, unhurried calm of a man who had delivered far more threatening news to far more dangerous men without once raising his voice.
"A debt incurred by King Robert, inherited by whoever now sits the Iron Throne. A throne, I understand, currently occupied by a child the bank has some considerable doubt is entitled to it at all. We find ourselves, my lord, in the position of deciding which claimant's eventual victory best serves the bank's interests. I have come to hear your case for why that claimant should be you." Sauron, present at Stannis' side as had become his settled custom in matters of counsel and strategy alike, studied the Braavosi factor with genuine interest. Here, at last, was a power in this realm that operated on principles he recognized intimately from ages of his own careful statecraft. Not loyalty, not honor, not even ambition in its ordinary mortal shape, but pure, patient calculation in service of an institution's continuity. The Iron Bank did not care who ruled the 7 kingdoms. It cared only that whoever ruled could be relied upon to pay what was owed. "My case," Stannis said, flat and characteristically unadorned, "is that I am the only claimant in this war currently spending men and gold to defend this entire realm from an enemy that will render every debt in every ledger meaningless if it is not stopped. Lend to Cersei Lannister, and you lend to a woman burning through her kingdom's treasury on wildfire and paranoia while the true war goes unanswered. Lend to me, and you lend to the one crown actually standing between your bank's precious ledgers and an army that does not honor debts, because it does not honor anything at all." Tycho Nestoris considered this with the same unhurried, unreadable calm he had brought to every exchange, and Sauron, watching the factor's careful, calculating eyes, understood, with the immediate recognition of one patient strategist for another, that here was a mind worth cultivating directly. "The bank has heard rumors," Tycho said, after a long moment, "of a stranger at your court, my lord, one whose counsel, several sources suggest, deserves rather more credit for your recent successes than your own counsel has publicly acknowledged. I confess a professional curiosity in meeting him." "You are meeting him," Sauron said, before Stannis could answer, and something in the quiet, unhurried authority of the interjection made even the composed Braavosi factor's careful expression shift, fractionally, toward genuine attention. "I understand your bank's calculus well, Master Nestoris. You do not lend to causes, you lend to certainties. I would put it to you plainly. There is no certainty left in this realm worth lending against, except the certainty that a war beyond the wall, if unanswered, ends every ledger your bank has ever kept, on every continent it has ever operated within. I do not ask you to believe in Stannis Baratheon's claim to a throne. I ask you to calculate, with whatever cold arithmetic your institution is famous for, the value of a debtor who survives against the value of debtors who will not. Tycho studied Sauron for a long, considering moment, the particular, appraising look of a man accustomed to reading desperation and bluff in equal measure across 1,000 such negotiations, and finding, in this instance, neither. "The Iron Bank," he said finally, "will extend the Crown's existing line of credit on the condition that repayment terms be renegotiated to reflect current circumstances. We do not lend out of charity, my lord. We lend because the man beside your king has just made, in very few words, the single most compelling argument for continued Westerosi solvency that this delegation has heard in the whole of our journey." He inclined his head towards Sauron, a gesture of genuine, professional respect. "I do not know what you are, stranger. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I am content not to know, so long as your arithmetic continues to prove sound." It was, Sauron reflected once the Braavosi delegation had departed, a genuinely satisfying negotiation. Not because the gold itself mattered greatly to him, 3 ages of forging kingdoms having long since taught him that gold was merely one tool among many, but because it confirmed something he had begun across these months to suspect about his own growing position in this fractured realm, that his usefulness had begun to extend beyond Stannis's court alone, into the wider, colder calculus of powers that answered to no crown at all.
It was in the weeks following the Iron Bank's departure that the first cracks began to show in the careful alliance Sauron had built with Stannis Baratheon's grim and unsentimental court. Not through any failure of counsel or strategy, but through the accumulating weight of small, uneasy observations that Jon Snow, watching from his own increasingly complicated position within the Watch's fracturing loyalties, found himself unable to simply set aside.
"You've been teaching Sir Justin's men," Jon said, finding Sauron alone one evening at the edge of Castle Black's training yard, watching a dozen of Stannis's household knights run through drills that had, subtly and gradually, begun to incorporate techniques and disciplines that bore no resemblance to any Westerosi style of swordsmanship Jon had ever witnessed. "Not merely swordplay, something else. I've seen the way some of them look at you now, my lord. It isn't respect anymore. It's closer to devotion." Sauron said nothing for a moment, watching the drilling knights with the same patient, unhurried attention he gave everything in this world, and when he finally spoke, there was, for the first time in their many conversations, something almost like genuine consideration in his voice, the sound of a mind weighing an accusation it had not expected to find worth weighing. "I have taught them discipline," he said. "Focus, a soldier's craft honed across ages your world has no record of. If some among them have come to trust my counsel more readily than they trust their own captains, Lord Snow, I would suggest that speaks to the quality of the counsel, not to any design on my part to bind them to me against their will." "Maybe," Jon said, and there was no real accusation in his voice. Only the same plain, careful honesty he had brought to every conversation between them since the top of the wall. "But I've spent my whole life reading men, my lord. Same as you have, I'd wager, only across a rather shorter span of years. And I've watched something change in a dozen men who spend their days near you. It isn't loyalty to Stannis anymore. In some of them, it's loyalty to you. I don't think you've done it on purpose. I'm not even certain you could stop it, if you tried, given what you are. But I think you should know it's happening, before it becomes something neither of us can easily undo." Sauron turned to look at the young man fully then, and felt, in the plain, unflinching honesty of the observation, the particular unease of being seen clearly by someone whose judgment he had, against every instinct 3 ages should have taught him, come to genuinely value. You believe I am corrupting this war's loyalties, Sauron said, even where I intend nothing of the sort. I believe, Jon said carefully, that you might not fully know the difference anymore, my lord, between intending something and simply being the kind of thing that makes it happen regardless. I don't say that as an accusation. I say it because someone needs to, and because I think of everyone in this war, you're the only one honest enough to actually hear it without deciding I need to be dealt with for saying it. It was, Sauron understood, standing in the cold evening air of a training yard, slowly filling with men whose devotion to him had grown. He now recognized with genuine and uncomfortable clarity, well beyond what mere sound counsel could account for, the truest and most dangerous thing anyone in this world had yet said to him.
He had not set out to bind these men. He had genuinely believed across these careful months that he offered only counsel, only discipline, only the ordinary and freely chosen respect a wise stranger might earn through demonstrated competence.
But he understood, turning Jon's plain words over with the same patient precision he applied to everything, that 3 ages of a will, built entirely around dominion, did not simply switch itself off because its bearer had decided, for once, to attempt something closer to genuine alliance. The old craft ran deeper than intention. It always had. I will be more careful, Sauron said finally, and meant it, in a way that startled him with its own sincerity. Thank you, Lord Snow, for the honesty. I do not think many souls in this realm would have risked speaking it plainly. Most souls in this realm are too frightened of you to try, Jon said, not unkindly. I've decided I'd rather be honest and wrong than safe and useless. Choose right, my lord. I meant it the first time I said it, and I mean it more now than I did then. He left Sauron alone in the darkening training yard, and Sauron stood a long while watching Stannis' knights complete their drills, men whose devotion, he now understood with unwelcome clarity, ran deeper and stranger than any battlefield council should have earned, and turned over. With more genuine uncertainty than he had permitted himself in 3 long ages of patient, unquestioned dominion, the plain and difficult weight of a question he had never once, in all his ancient existence, been required to seriously ask himself, what precisely am I building here, and for whom? The wildling host reached the wall's western reaches in the first true week of winter, 100,000 strong by the watch's grim, careful count, and the battle that followed at the foot of the wall itself was, by every measure Sauron applied to it, a smaller and more ordinary thing than the war he had come, across these long months, to understand was truly coming. Mance Rayder, king beyond the wall, proved himself in defeat, and subsequent capture exactly what Sauron's careful months of study of this land's political architecture had suggested he would be. Not a monster, not a conqueror, in any sense the 7 kingdoms' own 5 squabbling kings would have recognized, but a desperate leader who had spent years building an uneasy alliance among dozens of quarreling free folk clans for the single unifying purpose of fleeing an enemy that made every ordinary quarrel among his own people look, in retrospect, laughably small. You could have simply let them through, Sauron observed to Stannis, in the cold aftermath of the battle, watching watch officers and Stannis' own household knights herd a defeated and exhausted host of free folk toward makeshift camps at the wall's southern base, rather than the mass execution Stannis' own laws would, by strict reading, have demanded. The pardons you offered them cost you very little, my king, and by this wall 100,000 desperate souls who understand this enemy considerably better than any southern lord in your service ever will. I have learned that lesson from you, stranger, more than from any counsel of my own, Stannis said, grim as ever but carrying, Sauron noted, something that might in a lesser man have been called satisfaction. though I'll thank you not to remind me too often that a wildcat's pragmatism has begun to sound remarkably like your own particular brand of it." It was, Sauron reflected, watching the free folks' exhausted, wary faces as they filed past watch officers who had spent generations calling them wildlings and worse. A genuinely useful outcome regardless of whatever private satisfaction Stannis took in crediting it partly to his own growth as a king. 100,000 additional bodies for a wall that had, until recently, held only a few hundred against an enemy that took every fallen soldier and made it one more soldier of its own. He had not needed the ring for this. He had not needed anything beyond patient, careful counsel offered to a king already inclined, in his own hard and unsentimental way, toward exactly this kind of pragmatic mercy. Perhaps, Sauron thought, watching the free folk settle into camps that would, within days, begin the slow work of becoming something closer to allies than captives, this is what Jon Snow meant, in his own plain way. That counsel offered honestly, in service of something larger than my own dominion, need not corrupt the man who receives it. Only bind him willingly to a cause he might have chosen regardless. It was a distinction he found himself, with growing and uncomfortable frequency, unable to entirely dismiss as sentiment unworthy of 3 ages of hard-won wisdom. The true battle, when it finally came, arrived not at the wall itself, but in the deep black cold of a night some 3 weeks after the wildling host's surrender, when the great other's full and terrible strength finally, at long last, revealed itself against Castle Black's thin and desperate garrison, and it was, Sauron understood within moments of the first horn's blast splitting the darkness, precisely the war he had spent 5 careful months preparing himself to meet. The army that came out of the haunted forest that night was not merely dead men reanimated, though there were tens of thousands of those, shambling and silent, and utterly without fear, in a way that broke lesser soldiers' courage before a single blade was ever crossed. It was something considerably worse, arrayed with the patient, ancient precision of a general who had planned this exact assault across 8,000 years of careful waiting. The pale, terrible lieutenant Sauron had first glimpsed at the frozen lake, moving among the dead like conductors among an orchestra of the damned. And above and beyond all of it, at the army's furthest edge, a presence Sauron recognized immediately, with the cold and total clarity of one ancient power finally, fully perceiving another. The great other itself, he thought, standing at the wall's edge, as the first waves of the dead broke against Castle Black's hastily reinforced gates, feeling the full and terrible weight of that ancient, patient will finally turn its complete attention toward the battle unfolding beneath it. Come, at last, to see for itself what manner of thing has entered its world. He fought that night in a manner this realm had not yet seen from him, and would, he understood even as he began, never entirely forget having witnessed, not the quiet, subtle unraveling of courage and resolve he had employed at Bitterbridge, but something closer to the full and terrible shape of what he had once commanded across 3 ages of a different world's wars. He did not put on the ring. Some final, careful caution held him back from that last and most dangerous threshold, even now, even here. But he called upon everything short of it. The old will pressed outward like a physical force, breaking the dead's mindless advance in whole ranks at a time, holding a section of Castle Black's crumbling defense that would, by every ordinary military calculation, have fallen within the battle's first hour. Jon Snow fought beside him through the worst of it, Longclaw's Valyrian steel, doing to the wights around them what no ordinary blade could manage, and in the brief, brutal lulls between waves, Sauron caught, more than once, the young man's steady, assessing gaze. Not fear, though there was plenty of that in every other face around them, but something closer to careful, ongoing evaluation, as though Jon were still, even in the heart of this terrible battle, weighing exactly what kind of thing fought beside him, and toward what ultimate purpose. It was in the battle's final desperate hour, with Castle Black's outer defenses broken, and the garrison falling back toward the wall's base in a fighting retreat that few among them expected to survive, that the Great Other's true and terrible purpose finally, fully revealed itself. Not merely conquest, not merely the slow, patient accumulation of the dead into an ever-growing army, but something considerably more specific and considerably more alarming in its immediate and pressing intent. It came for Sauron directly, the pale, terrible lieutenant that broke from the army's ranks and crossed the last stretch of blood-soaked, corpse-strewn ground toward him, moved with a purpose entirely distinct from the mindless, grinding advance of the whites around it, deliberate, focused, unmistakably hunting a single and specific target amid the chaos of a battle that, for every other soul fighting within it, remained simply a desperate struggle for survival. Sauron met it at the base of the wall's great winch cage, and the duel that followed was unlike anything this realm's chroniclers, had any survived close enough to witness it clearly, would ever have been able to properly describe. Power meeting power, in a manner no ordinary sword or Valyrian steel or dragonglass blade could hope to match. Will pressed against will in a contest that had, Sauron understood even as he fought it, been building since the moment he had first felt this ancient enemy's cold and patient attention brush against his own awareness on Greenstone's shore, 5 long months and a lifetime of careful, patient work ago. He won. It cost him more than any single contest since the tear had first opened over an unfamiliar coastline, the pale lieutenant's own ancient and terrible power meeting his blow for blow, testing every fraction of 3 ages' hard-won strength before finally, in a burst of cold and shattering light, breaking apart into something that was not quite death, because Sauron understood, watching the fragments of it scatter into the freezing dark, that nothing born of the Great Other's design ever truly died in the way mortal things died. But it withdrew. The full weight of that ancient, patient attention pulled back from the battle's edge, taking with it enough of the night's terrible momentum that the remaining whites, leaderless in that section of the field, faltered long enough for Stannis' exhausted, battered garrison to hold the line, until a gray, reluctant dawn finally broke over a battlefield littered with the true dead, and the twice dead, and the small, hard-won margin of survival that Castle Black had, against every reasonable expectation, somehow managed to claim. Sauron stood alone at the wall's base in the battle's grim, exhausted aftermath, watching a pale winter sun rise over a field of corpses that would need burning before the day was through, and understood, with a clarity that settled into old and patient bones like the answer to a question 5 months in the asking, exactly what the previous night's duel had truly revealed. It does not merely recognize me as kin, he thought, watching smoke rise from the first of the pyres already being kindled across the battlefield. It recognizes me as a rival, a power old enough and dangerous enough to threaten 8,000 years of patient, singular purpose, and it has decided, having weighed that threat directly, that I am worth removing before I can grow further entrenched in a world it has always considered exclusively its own.
It was, in its way, the clearest answer he had yet received to the question Jon Snow's plain, unflinching honesty had first forced him to properly ask himself, weeks earlier in a darkening training yard, "What am I building here, and for whom?"
He understood now, standing at the base of a wall of ice, with the blood and cold of a battle he had barely survived still clinging to him, no longer merely a patient observer, cataloging a strange new world's magics and politics from careful, comfortable distance.
He had become, in the eyes of the one power in this realm, ancient enough to judge him accurately, a genuine and mortal threat to 8,000 years of singular design. And that recognition, terrible as it was, carried within it something Sauron had not expected to find in this cold and difficult place.
Not merely danger, purpose. Somewhere behind him, across a battlefield slowly filling with the grim, exhausted business of counting the dead and tending the wounded, Jon Snow was already moving among Castle Black's shattered garrison with the same steady, unflinching care he brought to everything. And Stannis Baratheon was already, Sauron did not doubt, beginning the hard, practical calculation of what this costly, narrow survival meant for whatever remained of his broken claim to a throne that felt, this cold morning, further away and less important than it had in many months. And far to the south, in a cluttered chamber beneath the Red Keep, a soft-handed eunuch's little birds were still gathering fragments of a war whose true shape none of them yet properly understood. While further south still, across a narrow sea, 3 dragons continued growing, slow and patient, and entirely unaware of the ancient rival now testing his own strength against powers this world had never before required a mortal war to fully reckon with.
Sauron turned from the battlefield and looked north one final time, toward a haunted forest that held, somewhere within its black and silent trees, an enemy now fully and mutually aware of exactly what stood against it, and thought, with the cold, patient clarity of 3 ages finally, fully committed to a war not of his own original choosing, but no longer, he understood, one he was prepared to simply walk away from either. Very well, he thought.
If this world requires me to choose, I choose. He did not yet know, turning back toward Castle Black's grim and grateful survivors, precisely what shape that choice would ultimately take. Whether the crown he had spent 5 careful months, quietly, patiently positioning himself to eventually claim, would still, in the end, matter more to him than the war now fully and mutually declared between himself and this world's oldest and most patient darkness.
But he understood, walking back across a battlefield littered with the true dead and the twice dead alike, that the season of careful, deniable observation had ended in truth as well as in name. Westeros, whether it yet fully understood the fact or not, now hosted 2 ancient and terrible powers within its fractured borders, and only one of them, Sauron intended to ensure, would still be standing when the true winter finally, fully broke.
King's Landing received the full and terrible account of Castle Black's battle, the way it received most news arriving from a wall. The capital had spent generations treating as a distant, half-mythical concern, with disbelief first, and then, as Raven after confirming Raven arrived bearing the same essential and impossible details, with a dawning, reluctant horror that even Cersei Lannister's court, hardened by years of war and betrayal, found difficult to fully absorb.
An army of the dead, Cersei said, reading the 3rd such report in as many days, her voice carrying the particular brittle scorn she reserved for anything that threatened to complicate her own careful, narrowing calculations of power. Led, apparently, by some ancient sorcerer, my brother's little birds insist arrived on Stannis' shore some months past, wielding a ring that binds men's wills. She set the parchment down with exaggerated care, meeting Tyrion's steady gaze across her council table. You expect me to believe this, brother? Or is this simply Stannis' latest and most creative excuse for having failed, yet again, to press his claim on this city? I expect you to believe, Tyrion said, with the particular weary patience he had cultivated across months of managing his sister's volatile and increasingly paranoid rule, that Varys's network does not fabricate consistent, independently corroborated reports from a dozen separate sources merely to embarrass a rival claimant. Something real happened at that wall, sister. Something considerably larger than this war we've all been fighting over a chair made of melted swords. It was Varys himself, standing at the council table's edge, with his usual soft and unreadable composure, carrying for once a genuine and visible strain, who offered the detail that finally, fully silenced the room's remaining skepticism.
"My little birds at the wall," he said, described the stranger. This ancient power now openly allied with Stannis Baratheon, fighting alone against one of the enemy's own commanders in the battle's final hour, and winning at a cost that nearly killed him. They described him as something no ordinary sorcerer or clever pretender could ever hope to be, Your Grace. I have spent a lifetime cultivating sources who do not exaggerate, because exaggeration serves my purposes considerably less than plain, unadorned truth does. I do not believe these accounts are exaggerated. Cersei studied the assembled council for a long moment. Her council, such as it remained, whittled down by war and paranoia and her own increasingly erratic judgment, to a handful of advisors she trusted less with every passing month. And Tyrion watched something calculating and dangerous move behind his sister's beautiful, brittle face. "If this ring exists," Cersei said slowly, "and does what your birds claim it does, binds men's wills, grants power beyond ordinary sorcery, then it is not a threat to be feared, brother. It is a prize to be won." She looked around the table, meeting each advisor's uneasy gaze in turn. "My son sits an insecure throne, surrounded by enemies on every side who believe him unfit to hold it. A weapon capable of binding wills absolutely, of turning rivals into servants without the tedious business of war and siege, and endless grinding negotiation. That is not a danger, Lord Varys. That is precisely the tool this crown requires to finally permanently secure itself." Tyrion felt something cold settle into his stomach, watching his sister's calculating expression, and understood, with the particular dread of a man who had spent years managing exactly this kind of dangerous ambition, that Cersei Lannister had just decided, on the strength of second-hand reports about a power she did not remotely understand, that the answer to Westeros's oldest and most terrible war was not to fight the Great Other at all, but to seize, for the crown's own use, whatever ancient and terrible instrument had proven capable of standing against it. "Sister," Tyrion said carefully, "I would counsel considerable caution before this crown decides its salvation lies in acquiring a weapon we do not understand, wielded until recently by a stranger who has, by every account, chosen to ally himself with your husband's own brother rather than with you. Then we offer him better terms than my husband's brother can," Cersei said, with the flat, dangerous certainty of a woman who had learned, across years of court intrigue, to treat every ambitious man's loyalty as ultimately purchasable, given sufficient incentive. "Every man has a price, Tyrion. Every power, however ancient, wants something. Find out what this stranger wants and offer it to him. Gold, land, a place in this court no southern king could hope to match. If Stannis Baratheon has found himself an ancient sorcerer's loyalty through nothing more than a shipwreck and a few months of flattering counsel, I see no reason this crown cannot win it away with considerably more to offer." It was, Tyrion understood, watching his sister's counsel dissolve into the beginnings of a plan that struck him as catastrophically, dangerously naive. Exactly the kind of arrogant miscalculation that had characterized nearly every decision Cersei had made since claiming the regency. A total willful blindness to the possibility that some powers in this world might not be interested in gold, or land, or a place at any mortal court, however grand. He did not yet know how right and how catastrophically wrong his sister's instinct actually was. The offer, when it finally reached Sauron some weeks later, carried by a small, careful delegation from King's Landing that arrived at Castle Black
under a flag of parley neither side entirely trusted, was, in its way, a genuinely fascinating document. And Sauron read the parchment's careful, flattering terms with the particular, cataloging interest he brought to everything this strange and fractured realm's power structures revealed of themselves. Lands, titles, a seat upon the small council itself, second only to the crown, gold beyond what any single lord in the Seven Kingdoms currently commanded. Cersei Lannister, it seemed, genuinely believed that an ancient power who had once forged instruments of dominion capable of binding entire ages of Middle-earth to his will might be swayed by the promise of a castle and a council seat in a fractured, war-torn kingdom he had already, quietly and thoroughly, begun outgrowing in his own patient estimation. "You find this amusing," Sir Justin Massey observed, watching Sauron's expression as he finished reading the parchment in Castle Black's cold, drafty solar. "I find it instructive," Sauron said, setting the parchment down with the same unhurried care he gave everything. "The Queen Regent believes power such as mine is purchased the way lesser men's loyalties are purchased, with gold, with title, with the ordinary currencies of mortal ambition. It tells me a great deal about the woman who sent this offer, and rather less than she perhaps hopes about what she believes she is dealing with." He did not accept the offer, though he found himself, in the following weeks, giving it rather more careful private consideration than he initially expected to. Not because gold or titles held any genuine appeal. 3 ages of building and losing entire kingdoms had long since taught him the essential hollowness of such mortal currencies, held in isolation from genuine power. But because the offer itself represented something worth understanding, a second court, a second claimant, genuinely eager to court his favor, offering him a foothold in King's Landing's own halls, that his current, careful alliance with Stannis alone could not provide. Perhaps, he thought, turning the possibility over with the same patient, calculating precision he applied to every strategic question in this world, there is no need to choose merely one crown to stand behind. Perhaps a power patient enough, and careful enough, might yet find use in courting both. It was, he understood even as the thought formed, precisely the kind of calculation that would have troubled Jon Snow's plain, unflinching honesty had the young man been present to hear it voiced. He found himself, for the first time in weeks, genuinely uncertain whether that trouble would have been fully unwarranted.
The dragons, when word of them finally reached Castle Black in full and confirmed detail, changed the shape of Sauron's private calculations more thoroughly than either Cersei's clumsy offer or Stannis's grim, ongoing war effort had yet managed.
3 of them, Melisandre said, reading the account a raven had carried from a trading captain recently returned from Slaver's Bay, her voice carrying a note of genuine, ancient awe that Sauron had rarely heard from her across their many months of alliance. Grown now to sizes no living man has witnessed in 100 years, commanded by a queen who has, by every account, begun conquering the great slaving cities of Essos in preparation for a war to reclaim her family's throne. She looked up, meeting Sauron's steady gaze across the solar's cold hearth. "R'hllor's flames have shown me glimpses of her for months, stranger. A queen of fire and blood, prophesied, some among my order believe, to be the very Azor Ahai reborn, who will lead this world's fight against the darkness. I confess, I do not know how that prophecy sits against your own presence in this war." Sauron considered this carefully, turning over what he now understood, from months of Melisandre's patient teaching, of the deep magic bound into dragons, creatures of fire and old blood, capable of destruction on a scale that even his own considerable power, absent the full weight of forces he had once commanded across 3 ages, could not easily match or counter. Dragons, he thought, feeling something that was not quite hunger, though it shared hunger's particular, patient shape, stirring in the old and careful chambers of his mind, a power this world holds that even I do not yet fully understand. A power that answers apparently to blood and will and old, half-forgotten magic, not entirely unlike the old craft of ring-binding that built my own dominion, in a different shape entirely.
He did not share the full weight of that private, hungry curiosity with Melisandre or with Stannis, when the King's Council convened to discuss what a Dragon Queen's growing power across the narrow sea might ultimately mean for a war against the dead that already, by every honest accounting, strained every resource this fractured realm could muster.
"She will come, eventually," Stannis said grimly, the council's mood heavy with the accumulating weight of threats now arriving from every direction at once. "A queen with dragons does not sit idle across the narrow sea forever, whatever slaving cities currently occupy her attention. When she comes, she will come for the Iron Throne, same as every other claimant in this exhausted war. And I do not know, stranger, whether this realm has strength enough left to fight the dead, and the throne's endless claimants, and dragons all at once." "Then perhaps," Sauron said, quiet, careful, turning the private hunger of his own curiosity into something that could, at least outwardly, serve the alliance he had spent so many careful months building. "The Dragon Queen is not, in the end, an enemy to be feared alongside everything else this realm faces. Perhaps she is simply one more power in need of the same choice every crown in this fractured land has ultimately faced since I arrived, whether to spend her strength on an old and narrow throne, or to spend it on the only war that will actually matter, if the true winter breaks before any of us are ready for it."
He did not say the rest of what moved, quiet and patient, behind that careful counsel, that a power capable of commanding dragons, properly approached, properly understood, might represent an asset worth considerably more than any council seat or gilded title Cersei Lannister's clumsy offer had proposed.
He had spent 3 ages learning that the greatest powers in any world were rarely won through conquest alone. They were won through patient cultivation, through understanding a rival's hungers and fears and offering, at precisely the right moment, exactly what that rival most needed to hear. He did not yet know whether Daenerys Targaryen, Queen of Fire and Blood, and 3 growing dragons, would prove a rival worth conquering, an ally worth cultivating, or something else entirely.
He suspected, turning the question over with the same patient, hungry curiosity that had carried him safely through 5 long months in this strange and fractured world, that he would need to cross the narrow sea himself, eventually, to properly find out.
It was Jon Snow once more who gave voice to the quiet unease that had begun, across these weeks of expanding ambition and multiplying offers, to settle over Castle Black's wary garrison regarding exactly what their ancient and powerful ally truly intended, in the end, to become. "You're thinking about the dragons," Jon said, finding Sauron alone once more at the top of the wall in the cold, gray evening light, the young man's steady gaze carrying the same plain, unflinching honesty it always had. "I can see it in the way you go quiet these past weeks, whenever anyone mentions the Queen across the narrow sea. You're not thinking about how to defeat her, or even how to ally with her against the true enemy." He paused, and something in his voice carried genuine, careful concern. "You're thinking about how to have her, her dragons, her power, the same way you're thinking about the Iron Throne, and the Iron Bank's gold, and everything else this fractured realm keeps offering you." Sauron said nothing for a long moment, watching the haunted forest beyond the wall in the deepening dusk, and understood, With the same uncomfortable clarity Jon's honesty always seemed to provoke in him, that the young man had once again seen something true that Sauron himself had not yet fully permitted into plain and open thought.
"I do not know what I am building here, Lord Snow," he said finally, and the admission cost him something. 3 ages of certainty finding this particular honesty considerably harder to voice than any careful, true-shaped deception ever had. "I told you once that I would choose right, when the choosing came. I find the longer I remain in this world that the choosing has become considerably less simple than I believed it would be when you first asked it of me." "It's simple," Jon said quietly. "It's only hard because you keep looking for a way to have both, the throne and the war against the dead. The queen's dragons and her trust, every crown's gold and every crown's gratitude, all at once, the way I imagine you built whatever kingdom you had before this one." He met Sauron's ancient, considering gaze steadily, without flinching, the way he had from their very first honest conversation atop this same cold wall. "You can't have all of it, my lord. Sooner or later, this world is going to ask you to choose between what serves the war against the true enemy and what simply serves you. I think you already know which choice is right. I think you're afraid of what it costs you to make it." He left Sauron alone atop the wall once more, and Sauron stood a long while in the gathering dark, watching the haunted forest that held, somewhere within it, an enemy now fully and mutually declared, and turned over, with more genuine and uncomfortable uncertainty than 3 ages of patient, singular purpose had ever previously required of him, the plain and difficult weight of a young man's steady, unflinching faith that he was, in fact, still capable of choosing right. He did not yet know, watching the last gray light fade from a sky heavy with the promise of the coming winter's full and terrible arrival, whether that faith was warranted. He found, turning at last back toward Castle Black's flickering torchlight, that he wanted, with an intensity that startled him, for it to be. The Iron Throne, when Sauron finally saw it with his own eyes some weeks later, proved a smaller and more brutal thing than 5 months of hearing men speak its name with reverence and terror in equal measure had led him to expect. A jagged, ugly seat of 1,000 melted swords, uncomfortable by design, a monument, he understood immediately, to conquest rather than to rule. He had not come to King's Landing to claim it. He had come, at Stannis' own grim and reluctant request, as an envoy in the strangest and most consequential negotiation this fractured war had yet produced. A parley called not between rival claimants to a single throne, but between every surviving power in the 7 kingdoms, summoned at last by the accumulating undeniable weight of reports from the Wall that even Cersei Lannister's willful blindness could no longer fully dismiss. They came from every corner of the realm that Winter had not already claimed. Cersei herself, brittle and dangerous behind a golden crown that sat, Sauron noted with quiet interest, considerably less securely than her council's careful protocols suggested. Tyrion at her side, watching everything with the sharp, weary attentiveness of a man who had spent years managing crises considerably smaller than the one now gathering in his sister's throne room. A Tyrell delegation representing the Reach's still considerable strength, wary and calculating in the wake of Renly's diminished claim, and arriving last and most dramatically, a queen newly crossed from Essos, with 3 dragons circling King's Landing's towers, in a display that silenced the assembled court more thoroughly than any herald's announcement could have managed. Daenerys Targaryen was younger than Sauron had expected, and considerably sharper. He understood this within moments of her arrival, watching her cross the throne room's length with the unhurried, absolute confidence of a woman who had conquered slaving cities and broken chains across an entire continent, her violet eyes finding his own across the crowded hall with an immediate, assessing directness,
that few mortals in this land had yet managed to fix upon him. "You are the stranger my scouts have spoken of," she said, when the room's careful protocols finally permitted them speech, her voice carrying the particular authority of a woman entirely unaccustomed to being told no. "The one who fought beside House Baratheon's exiled king at the Wall. I have heard a great many stories about what you are, in the weeks since I crossed the narrow sea. I find myself curious which of them, if any, prove true." "Most of them, I suspect," Sauron said, and something in the plain, unadorned honesty of the answer offered once more, with the peculiar ease he had come to extend only to those few in this realm whose judgment he had genuinely come to value, drew a flicker of surprised, careful interest across the young queen's composed features. "I am considerably older than this realm's stories have language for, your grace. I did not come to this world seeking a throne, though I understand a great many people in this room currently believe otherwise. I came in the end to find a war worth fighting. I believe I have found it, and I believe, watching your dragons circle this city today, that you may have found it too, whether you have yet named it as such to yourself." It was in the negotiations that followed, 3 long days of argument and accusation and the slow, grinding reconciliation of 5 fractured claims into something that might, if it held, finally answer the true and terrible war still gathering beyond the wall, that Sauron understood, with a clarity that settled at last into old and patient bones, like the answer to every question this strange world had posed him across 5 long months, exactly what choice remained before him. Cersei's offer still stood, renewed and sweetened across the negotiations' difficult first day. A council seat, lands, the ring's power quietly, hungrily coveted beneath every careful word her delegation offered. Daenerys, too, in her own more direct fashion, made plain across a private conversation on Dragonstone's cold battlements that she would value an alliance with a power capable of fighting beside dragons rather than against them, that a queen intent on breaking wheels and reshaping broken kingdoms might find genuine use for an ancient will experienced in exactly the kind of ruthless, patient reshaping she herself intended. He could have taken either offer. He understood this with total, unclouded clarity, turning over 5 months of careful, patient positioning that had built him, without ever quite intending the full scope of it, into precisely the kind of power both rival queens now openly, hungrily courted. He could have worn the ring at last, in this throne room full of exhausted, fractured claimants, and ended in a single terrible afternoon, the entire tangled ancient game of 5 kings and 1 throne that had occupied this realm's attention since before he ever washed ashore on Greenstone's rocks. He thought of Jon Snow, steady and unflinching atop a cold and ancient wall, asking him again and again across 5 patient months to choose right rather than merely choose wisely. He thought of the pale, terrible lieutenant he had fought and broken at Castle Black's edge, and the vast, patient, ancient will behind it that even now, he understood with total certainty, continued its own 8,000-year calculation of how and when to finally fully move against every living thing in this fractured, quarreling realm. He thought, finally, of 3 ages spent building kingdoms from fear and binding and dominion, and of 5 months spent, almost despite himself, building something he had not built in any of those 3 long ages, not dominion, but genuine and patient alliance, freely offered rather than compelled, tested and found, against every ancient instinct, worth preserving. "I will not take either crown's offer," Sauron said, on the negotiations' 3rd and final day, before an assembled court that had gathered expecting, by every account and rumor that had reached them, an ancient power's final and terrible price for its allegiance. "I do not want your throne, your grace, nor your council seat, nor your gold. I want this fractured realm to survive long enough for such prizes to matter again. I have seen what waits beyond your wall. I have fought it and bled for it, and I tell you now, before every crown assembled in this hall, that no throne any of you currently squabble over will exist at all if that war is lost for want of unity now, while unity is still possible to build. He looked around the throne room, meeting Cersei's furious, calculating glare, Daenerys's careful, reassessing gaze, Tyrion's weary and genuinely surprised attention, and understood, with a certainty that felt, for the first time in 3 long ages, entirely and uncomplicatedly his own, rather than merely strategic, that he had just made the first choice in this entire strange world that served nothing of his own ancient ambition at all. I ask instead, he said, that every crown in this hall lend its full strength. Dragons, gold, swords, every soldier this realm can muster, to the one war that will determine whether any of your claims survive the season. I ask you to choose, as I have chosen, to fight for something larger than the throne beneath you. I cannot promise you victory. I have fought this enemy myself, and I tell you plainly, it is the most patient and terrible power I have encountered across every age I have witnessed. But I promise you this, divided, squabbling over melted swords while the true winter breaks, none of you will survive to matter at all. The silence that followed held the particular, fragile weight of a fractured realm's last, best chance at unity, hanging on the edge of choices that 5 kings' worth of pride and ambition had, until this exact moment, made unthinkable. It was Daenerys Targaryen, Queen of Dragons and Broken Chains, who spoke first into that silence, her violet eyes steady, and, for the first time since her arrival, entirely without calculation. My dragons will fly north, she said, not for this throne, for the war that actually matters. She looked to Cersei, and something passed between the 2 queens that was not quite trust, but was, perhaps, the beginning of something that might yet grow into it, forged in the same hard, unsentimental necessity that had bent Stannis and the Free Folk into uneasy alliance months before. I would have every crown in this hall join me, if any of you value survival over pride. Cersei Lannister, cornered by circumstance and her own crumbling position into a choice she would never, in ordinary times, have willingly made, gave a single, brittle nod. Not surrender, not truly, but the grim, practical calculation of a woman who understood, at last, that a throne worth nothing was not worth dying alone to defend. And Sauron, standing at the center of a fractured realm's first genuine moment of unity in 5 long months of patient, careful work, understood that he had, at last, made the choice Jon Snow had asked of him atop a cold and ancient wall. Not the choice that served his own ancient ambition most efficiently, but the choice that served something larger than himself, freely and fully, for the first time in 3 long ages of existence. He did not yet know whether the coming war, when it finally fully broke upon this fragile and hard-won unity, would prove winnable at all.
He understood only that he intended, whatever came, to fight it as an ally to this strange and stubborn world rather than as its conqueror, and that the choosing, difficult and costly as it had been, had settled something in him that 3 ages of dominion had never once managed to settle. Something that felt, against every ancient instinct, remarkably like peace.
The true winter broke 6 weeks later, and the war that followed would be sung of, in whatever fragments of history survived it, as the longest night the 7 kingdoms had ever faced. Dragons and dead men, Valyrian steel, and an ancient will that had once built and broken kingdoms across ages this world would never fully understand, all of it thrown together at last, against an enemy 8,000 years in the patient making.
Sauron did not know, standing at the wall's shattered edge in the war's final and terrible hour, whether he fought that battle as Westeros's ally or as something the realm's own histories would never quite find the right word for. He knew only that when the Great Other's ancient will finally fully broke against the combined weight of dragonfire and old magic, and a ring he had, at the last, chosen to wear not for dominion, but for one final, desperate working in defense of a world not his own, he felt something in himself break and remake alongside it. 3 ages of singular purpose, finally, fully spent on something other than his own endless hunger for rule. Jon Snow found him afterward, among the ash and the silence and the first gray light of a morning that felt, for the first time in longer than any living soul could remember, entirely and simply like morning. "You chose right," Jon said, and there was no question in it, only quiet, steady certainty. "I did not know I still could," Sauron said, and meant it. He did not stay to claim any throne the war's survivors offered him, in the grateful, exhausted weeks that followed. Not Cersei's council seat, not Daenerys's alliance of dragons and broken chains, not even the quiet, honest friendship Stannis Baratheon extended him, gruffly, across a hearth in a wall finally at peace. He left, in the end, the way he had arrived, alone and uncertain and searching for a tear in the world's fabric that might yet carry him home or somewhere new entirely. But he left something behind him in Westeros that 3 ages of dominion had never once managed to leave in any kingdom he had built and broken before. Not fear and not ruin, but the plain, hard-won proof that even the oldest and most patient darkness could, when finally and fully asked, choose to become something else. Somewhere beyond the wall, in a haunted forest gone quiet at last, the wind carried on, indifferent, the way it always had. But it did not carry cold the way it once did.